to discuss last time, which is why I think this meeting is important in terms of us completing our responsibility in terms of the scrutiny process. And I stress again that that is absolutely sitting at the fault of the process and not anybody sitting here. So we thank our guests today for coming to answer these extra questions. We do recognise the burden that it puts upon you, and it's a commitment from me and I know others here to do what we can to look at this process next year to make it more efficient. So thank you for that. So if I move to the first question, which actually touches very much on that point, and the question is going to be to the Mayor, which is, this year we're again seeing a late notice increase in income and a late notice replanning of expenditure. In November, we wrote a warning that this was likely to happen and to request that the process for allocating these last-minute funds be made more transparent. What are your thoughts on this process and how can it work better in the future?
Thank you. I was reflecting when you were speaking the process when I was in government versus the process now. When I was a minister in the Department for Communities and Local Government, we managed to publish a 3-year settlement on the 26th of November 2008, with a final settlement on the 21st of January. And we gave MPs a huge amount of time to discuss that, including the then Mayor. And I consider the process now, my comparator minister now published the budget 1 year, not 3, incredibly late, gave MPs only 48 hours to study the detail before debating it. And so I think we should be saying to the government, there's no reason for the delay. If we could do it when we were in government, I don't see why this lot can't. They've made promises in the past about giving us more notice, 3-year budgets, and broken those promises. And if on a cross-party basis, the Assembly are amenable to lobbying the government, I think that's not a bad thing.
We're in wild agreement right at the very beginning of the meeting, so that's good. I think the process could be better run. And it's something, as I said, that we're committed to doing after this process is finished. So looking specifically then about that extra income that came in, it was around the region of 200 million. And you'll know we've discussed this previously because we've seen somewhere in the region of that amount of cash turning up late in the process over the last 6 years. And we spoke at previous meetings about doing some sort of forward planning, because if it's happened in the past, there's every chance it would happen again. Do you think there's a way that during that budget setting process we could maybe have a thought or projection of what's happened in the past and how we could prepare for that so we don't get these last minute decisions? Because that's where I think some of the tension in these committee meetings is that there are those last minute decisions which it feels like haven't been through the proper scrutiny process. Sort of wish list we described it as last time, didn't we?
No. For a number of reasons. The two biggest reasons, and I probably should bring in the Executive Director of Resources, who has got more experience of this than members on the committee. The two big reasons why it won't make sense is if you just assess the predictions the councils made in relation to council tax base. I think half of the councils, the figures came in more than they projected. A third came in less than they projected. The Financial Times reported how our economy is powered ahead compared to other regions, which people couldn't have predicted. And I think you're always in a position far more favourable to have a budget where you are making decisions with additional monies potentially coming in, rather than having budgets where you're having to make cuts in the space of 2 weeks. But it's probably best for David Galley to explain from his experience, the AA credit rated David Galley, to explain his experience in this sort of stuff and why the suggestion from the Budget Performance Committee just won't work.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, Peter. Morning, committee. I mean, as you all know, I'm sure by reading the detailed papers, I mean, the budget process we have is incredibly complex. And although I've been criticised before about overusing the word uncertain, there's still massive uncertainty that we have, which is endemic to the system. So I'm sure there are things that we can work on, and thank you for your earlier comments. I'm sure there are things we can work on to try and make the process more functional. But we do have a central problem here, because the business rates, which I think is the central driver of the issue you've raised, is subject to such complexity, such uncertainty, such the whim of a civil servant's pen. So just last week we had a situation where we had a very obscure set of regulations that were issued by the government without any consultation to us, that basically confirmed a assumption that we had made that could have gained or lost us £80 million. So, I've said it before, but, a 1% change ends up with 33 million impact. So, very, very small marginal changes, things that are built into a very complex system, lead to this great level of volatility, which is incredibly hard to predict.
This is around the business rate multiplier, right? So you get the slight. It's not no.
It includes that, yeah. but it also is endemic to the system. So
yeah.
We still have a whole set of issues emerging from boroughs making assumptions about their provisions for bad debt, and all the issues that arise from the government's remaining very complex but welcome reliefs as part of the business rate system to cope with the pandemic, which are still unwinding. The other thing I'd add is that there's also huge variation across London. So although it's I'm sure you would welcome the improvement we've had in central London, which shows that central London in particular is recovering better than we'd have thought, or people would have generally thought, which is welcome. But there are still issues in outer London boroughs where the impact of the pandemic is still having a negative impact here on business rates projections. So there's huge variation. The other thing I'd add, although it's probably looking further out now, is that there's still major threats to the future of the system, particularly around business rates. So a business rates reset will happen at some particular point. And the key driver, Peter, as you know, of the growth that we've had on business rates, has arisen because of us having a system where we get the benefit of that growth. Now, the reset, it's on the tin, a reset means that government would claw back that growth. Now, we have to make some assumptions around the extent to which they might do that, but a reset, implies a full clawback, so that money can then be redistributed across the rest of the country. So there remain, huge uncertainties. I'd welcome a dialogue, both, formal or informal, to try and make the process more helpful, because the last thing, that we would want to do is get caught in the headlights of the natural concerns that you've raised. I'm sure there are things that we can do to assist that process.
And that's absolutely how I kicked off the meeting, was talking about that process, and that was a sentiment echoed by the Mayor as well. So, that money's safe, as Jim Bowen used to say on Bullseye. But it's about how, with the process we've got at the moment, how do we do proper and efficient scrutiny? So the 188 million, again, in that 200 million region that has been the same for the last 6 years, it did arrive at the last minute. So what this committee has talked about over the years, the 2 years I've been on it, and I'm reliably informed, has done previously, is what's the process for when that cash comes in? What's the process that's undertaken in that very short 2-week period after the scrutiny process is finished to allocate that funding to a point where you get big announcements, as we've had it this week? So, Mr. Mayor, maybe if you can talk us through that. What's the process that's undertaken after that extra cash comes in to allocate it?
I think that's one for me, Chair. The first thing I would say is obviously the scrutiny process hasn't quite finished, because we still have the plenary on Thursday,
sure,
which is by because I wouldn't
want to be misrepresented. For the Budget and Scrutiny Committee, that process is finished. Is the point,
I agree that the committee has done its series of meetings, but although not obviously as we're here, but the law sets out that plenary happens after the information is available for obvious reasons. So to come on to the substance of your question, I'll talk you through the process. So, as you know, it's the 31st January deadline for the billing authorities to give us the information around council tax and business rates. So Ember was in a position to inform me on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 1st of February, of the council tax position. It did change marginally from there, but in substance, it was as advised then. But at that stage, we didn't have the numbers for all the business rates, because obviously it is hugely dependent, as I think David outlined, on what happens in some of the key central London boroughs. And frankly, we know they were working very hard on it, but it's very complicated works, and the information they need from the government is quite late, and the billing authorities weren't in a position to advise those numbers. They all had done so by Friday the 3rd, which to their credit is actually slightly better than sometimes has happened in previous years. So probably it was just before 4 p.m. on Friday the 3rd that Enver could notify me of what the business rate position was. So then in terms of the decision-making timeline from there, obviously we had to publish the final draft budget on the 15th of February, so a week and a day before the plenary meeting on the 23rd. So what that meant was that we needed decisions from the Mayor by Wednesday the 8th of February in order that the budget documents could be prepared for the 15th. So in essence, that gave Enver and his team a very frantic 48 hours to apply all those decisions into the budget documents, which are circa 80,000 words. David and myself then did a review of those across the weekend, and then Enver and his team would have Monday, Tuesday morning to go through our feedback and do all their final checks, noting, of course, that this is a statutory thing with statutory figures around council tax, and absolutely has to be
David,
right.
Just to help, so this is about the money coming in, right? And,
yeah.
And again, I'll repeat it again. I agree. I think this could be much better. But it's once that money's in, then there is a set of decisions taken about how that money's spent.
Yes, and that's what I was explaining, Chair, was that the time we have was between essentially 4 p.m. on Friday the 3rd and then Wednesday the 8th, when we needed the final decisions from the Mayor in order to hit the timetable to publish the documents. So that is the decision-making window that we have to deal with. And of course, you can't really start any sooner, because, being honest, the situation on business rates in terms of the central London boroughs having made more provision for bad debt than it turned out they needed was, I think it's fair to say, a surprise to all of us. Yeah, and so it absolutely was new news. So the process that was followed then in terms of decision making is, firstly, of course, this is the culmination of a budget process that lasts many months, and there are a lot of discussions going on between the Mayor and myself, between the Mayor and functional body leadership, through scrutiny sessions, the discussions that I would have and with colleagues in the Mayor's office. And so, we know going into that what the Mayor's priorities are, and he's been very transparent about them in terms of, principally keeping Londoners safe and the cost of living crisis. And then it's a case of putting together options from that, which we did that Friday evening and across the weekend, in order that on the Monday I could brief the Mayor, say, look, this is the funding that we're advised available. Those numbers still changing, by the way. We lost about £15 million in business rates between what we were told on the Friday afternoon and where we finished up on the Monday evening. So we don't have final figures to work with until that point. And so on the Monday, it was a case of explaining to the Mayor the situation, giving him some options and choices, and listening to the Mayor, taking his
to understand
steer.
that, then, because we've been at previous meetings where we've talked about. So just so I can keep up with you, because there's lots of information to take in here. So you get a pretty final number by that February. It was around 188, I think, on that Friday. And then you work up decisions over the Monday and present that over the weekend, and present that to the Mayor on Monday for him
So
to
no,
start making a decision?
we don't work out decisions.
Or work up options, rather.
So yeah, we obviously have some things in mind already, and it's a case of applying that in the context. If somebody says something, oh right, here's an idea, it would cost £100 million, but it turns out we've only got £50 million. Well, we're not going to present that to the mayor because obviously it's undeliverable. So it's about working out those options and presenting it to the mayor on the Monday, gaining his feedback, and he'll say, yeah, I really want to do that, that's really important. That idea, no, I don't think that's important. Oh, hang on,
and
do something different
all of those
on
ideas
that.
are worked up over the weekend.
So, well, many things we've got already, but where we need to do more work over the weekend, then obviously we would do that. And certainly it needs what I can't do is I can't pull together that stuff for the mayor until the weekend.
I get that.
Because, as I say, we don't know the scale of funding, and so I could be proposing something to him that we don't have the money to do, and so you have to wait until you get those numbers, and then on the Monday discuss it with the mayor and colleagues, and arrange whatever further briefing the mayor wants, and build in then ultimately come back to him on Wednesday with a final proposal based on the steers he's given, and then the mayor can either say yes, that's perfect, or no, change that bit of it.
So to summarise, once the figures are pretty final at the end of that week, you work up options over the weekend and present it to the mayor. That's just to condense that down.
Work-up's probably is slightly misleading.
Well,
I mean, we do work to the extent that's needed, but hopefully we've got a lot of things on the books
David,
already.
I'm desperately trying to get clarity here because we've had conversations in the past about, and I dubbed it wish list. You can find another phrase, which was I'll dig the minutes out, but I think I said it would be reasonable, would it not, to have some sort of schemes ready to go. So you had some stuff on the shelf. If you got an extra 50 million, 100 million, 150 million, 200 million, whatever it was, that once you got the final number, you could reach for them and say, okay, this is the prepared plan we've got. That would mean you wouldn't have a crazy weekend trying to knock this all up from scratch. But I was told that didn't happen, that there wasn't a wish list, there wasn't sort of schemes being developed or ready to go. I mean, I've asked 2 or 3 times, I'm looking around the committee for nods, but I think we have.
Nodding like a dog, yeah.
So are there schemes that are sort of being prepared? Are there things on simmer waiting for the cash to come in? Because if there are, let's start getting ready for next year now.
So there are some things it's working through the process. So as an example, in the final draft budget, the mayor allocated an extra £3.3 million to the Met to bring the work for leadership support for the Met up to £15 million. And that was absolutely something that was on the books that the Mayor and I discussed with the Commissioner when we were finalising the draft budget in January, as the Commissioner felt £15 million was the level that he really needed. He'd like more, but he really needed to see. But that just wasn't deliverable within the confines of the draft budget. So that was an example of something absolutely being on the books. Other things are around, but there are, it often becomes a question of scale, given the resources available, and ensuring then that you've got the latest assessment of that in order that you're giving an up-to-date picture to the mayor.
So I'm trying to understand if it's kind of like a feeding frenzy when this money comes in. So maybe, Mr. Mayor, I mean, this figure's released. It comes out on the Thursday or the Friday. Do you come under any pressure from functional bodies or anybody like that says, we've seen there's this extra cash in the system, can you allocate stuff to us? Do people start bidding for it?
Pressure's not the word I'd use.
What word would you use?
The words that the Chief of Staff used.
Which was what?
Do you want to repeat them, David?
Yeah. It's not.
No.
So
I'm essentially asking.
Let me deal directly with the question.
Because the Mayor hasn't finished answering the question I asked him, David. So I'm asking you, when that money comes in, do you start getting phone calls? Do people start saying there's extra money? Is there a bidding process? What happens?
No, there's no phone calls.
Yeah. So to answer your question, I manage the process.
Yeah.
There isn't time, nor is it appropriate for us to run some sort of bidding process. Obviously, the goal of the budget process is, by the time we've got to this point, to have balanced, deliverable budgets for each organisation in the group. And then the question becomes, okay, right, what more would the Mayor want to do? Clearly, sometimes that will be delivery of policy goals. Other times it will be other things where we judge it's necessary to go further. And obviously through the budget process, I'm talking to organisations around the group and gaining that understanding.
So it's you running the budget, David, not the Mayor, is that right?
So no, it's the Mayor who writes the budget.
Then nobody talks to him and you don't talk to him until the Wednesday.
It's my job to collate that on behalf of the Mayor and give him the information and the options to take the decisions.
So the extra money comes in, you and your team work it up over the weekend, nobody speaks to the Mayor, none of the functional bodies get in touch with anybody. Do they get in touch with you, David, to bid for it, or is the process kind of set of what's going to happen?
So, as I said, it's not. We don't run a bidding process. We run it. It's for the Mayor to take the decisions about the allocations, and all the information the Mayor needs in terms of options, etc. It's my job to ensure is pulled together. And so that, where that involves talking to functional bodies, well then we'll, or directorates within the GLA, well then absolutely we have those conversations. There's an example in there in terms of non-firefighter pay at the fire brigade, which would be an example of that process working. But, we have those conversations as necessary. Given that ultimately it's a decision for the Mayor to make the trade-offs and decide what the allocations are, and we're pulling information all through the budget process in order to support the Mayor's decision-making at that very constrained window.
So is there a set criteria in which you assess that new spending plan?
It's about delivery against the Mayor's priorities.
So that's quite broad when you think about some of these big plans. So, a really interesting plan launched yesterday. That's a big spending plan, big commitment, huge interaction with a number of bodies. That seems like a lot to work up over a weekend. You agree or disagree?
I don't think it was. Remember the Mayor had talked about the importance of universal free school meals and set out what delivering it in London would cost back in the early autumn. So
But there'd been no work on it previously.
So that what do you mean by previously? He'd set it out back in the autumn.
But not this specific spending. So, but this is what I'm trying to get to the bottom of, David, and the Mayor's not answering questions. So, is it the sort of the broad approach over the sort of wide targets that the Mayor has, or are there specific plans being worked up through the years waiting to see if there's appropriate funding?
So, as I said, through the budget process, we're always looking at opportunities to be able to go further. In the case of universal free school meals, I forget the precise date, but the Mayor had said publicly this should happen in London, called on the government to fund it, set out about what the costings would be, and so then this was something that was on our radar as an option that the Mayor might wish to choose to do in the event that the government, as has transpired, hasn't funded it. And so what we were able to do in the period leading up to the Mayor taking decisions is pick up that work, check it was still accurate and relevant, test it, etc., in order that the Mayor would be, if presenting it's an option to the Mayor, it's something we're comfortable that could be delivered if he chose to support it.
So when that extra cash comes in, are the options that you could look at everything from adding to scrappage schemes to looking at council tax presets to all that? Is everything on the table when that money arrives?
I mean, in a theoretical sense, but in a practical sense, as I said, it's about the Mayor's priorities. And so what we're looking at is, right, how can we use the additional money in order to progress the Mayor's priorities?
Okay. So theoretically, there is at that late stage, there are options on the table to make some changes to those sort of core taxes like council tax, etc., or to put some more money into the scrappage scheme to do other things to help. And this is options that are taken late in the day without any sort of previous build-up of a scheme.
So I don't follow your last
I could have
point.
I could have worded that better. So the money comes in, everything's on the table, but it's a sort of last-minute working up of schemes that have already been on the boil that are presented to the mayor as options to take the decision.
So it's about saying, okay, we already have a budget that is balanced, is deliverable in each organisation.
Okay.
Additional resources are available, and then giving the mayor options about how to use those in order to progress his priorities.
So thank you. That's a better way of putting it, which is actually everything's set, and when the extra surprise money, as I called it before, comes in, it's probably going to be spent on something new rather than anything that we've discussed in the budget setting process.
Well,
because that's how it's been before.
If there's an option to go to get for instance, the mayor's already allocated funding for 500 PCSOs, so an option in theory would be say, well, you can do, we could increase that number, that then hits up against the hurdle, obviously, of the need for, well, there's a test about is there income recurring, because you need to pay PCA salaries every year, which is why it's a problem. You also have to look at deliverability, etc. And obviously, we looked at all that in the build-up to the draft budget in terms of making those proposals, that we did then. And so, in one sense, that was on the table. In another sense, it wasn't, because we'd already looked at it, and we knew that wasn't going to be a place that was sensible to go.
Okay. All right. I'm going to just open this up to see if anyone else here has got any questions. Kupresh.
Thank you, Chair. So it's also my first time on the Assembly, and I understand the challenges that you're facing in setting the budget, because, as it says in the paperwork, every year more money comes in than expected. But actually, I understand the challenge to assume it into your base budget and to assume it's money coming in every year, because with these things, it's always the case that the 1 year where you assume the money, it may not turn up. And we all know the dangers of unfunded spending, as we saw with Trussonomics and the Kamikaze budget as well. Maybe my question's on more for David Galley. So what would be the impact of assuming the monies if it doesn't come through?
Thank you, Kripesh. A really good question. So it goes back to the assumptions I've made about the business rates reset. So ultimately, as you see from the paperwork, I've only assumed a very small element of the business rates to be ongoing, some 3.7 million out of the 157 million of business rates. Now, because of that level of uncertainty that I described earlier, then clearly a different judgment could be made, and could be made at a later point. If the government, say, were to make an announcement around business rates reset or the percentages of growth that could be retained, then obviously that could then be reviewed. But as you say, there are huge dangers of entering into ongoing commitments from a resource that I can only see as being largely one-off.
So in terms of the items where the money has been allocated, has money been put into anything that could be recurring spending?
Maybe if I come in there, Krupa. So I telegraphed at previous Budget Performance Committee meetings and plenaries my priorities, 4 or 5 priorities. But within those, you've got to think about recurring and one-offs. And it's a big consideration. You'll remember, because of the announcements I made a few years ago in relation to, for example, the Young Londoners Fund, £75 million. We knew it was one-off, and we spread it over 3 years. You also know we paid for additional police officers with money from business rates, and we've now set out in this budget how we're going to pay for that ongoing forward. That's one of the challenges we have. What we don't want to do is inadvertently use one-off money for things that we know are recurring. So when David Bellamy was explaining, a logical conclusion could be, well, you've agreed to pay for 500 PCSOs, you've got this additional money coming in, why don't you pay for more? Well, there's a very good reason why not. Firstly, we know of the recruitment challenges, but also we want to make sure we get the right quality and the right vetting. But secondly, how do we pay for those officers in subsequent years. And that's why it's really important when it comes to these decisions that you look at both recurring but also one-off. But also the point you made to David Galley in the first question you asked him, what you don't want to do is to create false expectation that monies could be spent in an area or a functional body that don't materialise or that are cut. And what I do is take the advice of the Executive Director of Resources and his able assistant rather than making decisions that could lead to the announcement not being able to be funded either in this year or subsequent years.
Krupesh, if I could just add to answer your question. On page 7 of part 1 of the budget paperwork, it sets out the items that are ongoing with a little asterisk. So, for instance, the New Year's Eve inflationary costs are ongoing at 1.3 million. The pay provision for MOPAC and VRU, for instance, is ongoing. They're all set out on that page 7 of part 1.
Thank you. Susan Hall is coming next.
Thank you. You touched on the extra money and what you're going to do with it, Mr. Mayor. Can I ask you, do primary schools actually have the capacity to provide hot school meals to all their pupils?
Yeah, and the reason why we didn't announce this to happen straight away is to give those primary schools who need time to build up capacity in relation to kit or in relation to staff, for them to do so in advance of September. We're also working closely with not just the catering associations, but also the councils who have been integral to the 5 boroughs, which currently have free school meals universally applicable for primary school children, none of them Tory, I'm afraid. Islington, Newham, Southwark, Westminster and Tower Hamlets. And so we're using the experience from those councils. Newham's a good example. So Newham went from having 45% children receiving meals prior to it being universal, get up to 90%. And so what we need to do is work with those councils, those schools, the catering associations in advance of September to make sure they're ready to go for the start of the next academic year.
Okay, so how much capital is going to be needed to enlarge some of their kitchens, etc., etc.?
Well, the good news is a lot of this work was done in relation to, a few years ago, in relation to reception years 1 and 2. So those are some of the conversations we'll be having with the councils. This Sunday evening, for example, a meeting was held with some of the councils to discuss some of these issues, and we'll have to wait and see in relation to any requirements there may be. We don't think there'll be challenges in relation to schools taking up the offer, but clearly we'll speak to councils and if need be schools to resolve these issues. But I think we'll make it work.
You think, but you don't know. You also, therefore, don't know what the capital cost will be in putting in bigger kitchens if necessary, or indeed if those schools have got the space to put that capacity in. Or have you spoken to them all?
We've spoken to the schools. We've spoken to schools and councils over the course of the last few days, and they're really excited about the announcement. I'm just disappointed the Tories oppose it.
Few days. So in a few days, you know then what the capital expense will be, or just that everybody's excited?
From September, every primary school child in London will be able to receive free school meals.
Yeah, I know
you oppose this. No, but I'm very proud of this policy.
Try not to put words in my mouth, Mr. Mayor. So let's go back to.
So do you support this? Do you support this?
Let's go back.
Do you support this?
No.
Well,
it's
clearly.
Question time.
So the questions have started coming this direction already, David. You were quite right. You were quite right.
The Tories oppose.
No, Mr. Mayor. Come on, let's no.
It's okay.
Let's leave the polemic.
Why don't you just answer the question? How much is this actually going to cost capital-wise, and do any of these schools have capacity issues and lack of space to increase their kitchens? You must know that, because if there's quite a few, it's going to blow a massive hole in that budget. So come and tell me exactly what issues do some of the schools have, or have you not spoken to them all? Well,
I appreciate Conservatives oppose this policy. But we're
you're determined to get that through. Just answer my questions for once, please.
We're very proud of this policy. And what this policy will mean is from September, every primary school child in London will be able to receive free school meals.
Yeah, I can hear and comprehend what you're answers are, but they're not actually the answers to the questions. So I'll go back to the question, which is quite simple. How much is it going to cost in capital to increase kitchens? How many kitchens are you going to have to increase? Do any schools have problems with the size of the kitchens or with any land that they might need to increase the size or capacity? I appreciate you've probably only spoken to Labour councils, but there are other councils out there. Have you actually spoken to them?
Well, we are confident that from September, every primary school child in London will be able to receive a free school meal. And I appreciate the opposition you have to this, but I'm quite clear we're going to make it work from the start of the next academic year.
Yes, I'm confident that you never answer any of my questions properly. However, sometimes you might surprise me. So when will we know exactly what issues there may be in extending this this latest project of yours? When will we know what issues there will be on the capital side of extending this policy?
Sorry, do you mean opposition? I don't follow the question.
Well, it's quite an easy question, Mr. Mayor. Just concentrate. I keep asking the same thing.
I'm going to step in. No. I'm going to step in because I see what you're doing. You're trying to use the meeting to drive a political point. This is a budget and performance meeting, and it's a very clear budget question. There's been no suggestion from the Assembly member of opposition or support. It's a budget question about what is the capital expenditure of the scheme. If you want to come back and say we don't know because David just worked it up last weekend, that's perfectly understandable, and we can see that you need more time to go away and do it. It's a perfectly reasonable question about budget.
Well, there's a newsflash there, everyone. The chairman of the Budget and Performance Committee is not political. Nor are the Tory members.
We're highly political, but actually we are in a budget meeting, Mr. Mayor. I have asked you very civilly the same question about 5 times. You are incapable of answering it. Perhaps David Bellamy could answer the actual question since you are incapable of answering the question. Mr. Bellamy, how much is going to be the capital cost in enlarging some of these kitchens? Can every single primary school manage to do that? Will there be issues in any particular school, or do you not know?
Well, clearly there are a very large number of primary schools across London. And
that's right.
Yeah. And it isn't possible to sit here and set out precisely the specifics of each of those. But yeah, that's why in recent weeks before this was announced, we've been engaging with learning from those councils who have already done this and found a way to make it happen. Discussing with London councils about how we get going and we actually work as a partnership with all the local authorities across London to deliver this and how we handle it. It's worth saying that in the costings and the allocation the Mayor made for this policy, we took a very conservative view, lowercase c, of uptake because, as the Mayor referred to what happened in Newham, it isn't the case that you ever get 100% uptake of free school meals, as some people just choose not to, as absolutely is their right. And that will create some capacity in the budget that we can look at and supporting some of those challenges.
But do you not think if you've only spoken to councils that have got a high percentage of free school meals students, they're obviously going to have a greater capacity within their kitchens? Have you spoken to any councils that have very small uptake on free school meals, which may not have such a large capacity in their kitchens?
So I think what you see is if you think about a borough like Westminster, you get a huge variety in terms of socio-economic circumstances, and different schools there will be in different situations, and so those initial discussions do give an important insight into that, and that's something that now that we're able to talk more widely and publicly about the policy, we'll be able to have those detailed discussions with other boroughs and apply the learnings from the Westminsters and the others to the different situations around the city.
Okay, I'm just concerned that if you're not sure of the costing, which you can't be, how you think that you're going to provide this when you have no idea how many schools will have issues with actually fulfilling this. But keeping on the same sort of subject, Mr. Mayor, this is definitely for you to answer. If you're hiking council tax by nearly 10%, which is regressive, as you know, if you went to tax people, if you want to tax people and businesses through the extended ULEZ, also which will affect the most vulnerable without doubt. And it was interesting that David Galley did comment that in collection of council tax and business rates in outer London, businesses have more issues. Therefore, that will affect people that are having to pay the ULEZ. And then you want to give that money or taking from people with less money and give it to primary school pupils with free lunches, including those that are lucky enough to have parents that can afford those. Do you think that it's a good thing to take money, if, in effect, through taxation from those that can least afford it to pay for something for parents, and in lots of instances, they will be able to afford it? Well,
for the benefit of the chairman who may have missed that, this is the evidence that the Tories oppose universal free school bills.
I'm asking whether you think it's a good idea, Mr. Mayor.
Confirmation, if it was required, that the Conservatives oppose the provision of universal free school meals. So what's happening in the GLA is ostensibly because of a government requirement for us to raise council tax to pay for TfL as part of the funding deal, to increase the police precept to avoid being penalised this year and subsequent years, and to pay for the London Fire Brigade to meet obligations placed upon them by Grenfell and inflation. The GLA is increasing council tax about £3.21 a month, £38.55. £38.55, ostensibly because of the government. I look forward to seeing how councillors in Harrow vote to increase their council tax by £82.16. £82.16 if you're... I don't know if there's any councillors in Harrow here, but we'll wait and see if any councillors in Harrow vote against that increase of £82.16 for Harrow council tax payers. Or Havering, also affected by the expansion, will increase their council tax by £78.61, more than double what the GLA has been forced to do by the Conservative government. Hillingdon, £63
Mr. Mayor.
Tory Bromley,
Mr. Mayor,
are raising their council tax by £66.92.
Mr. Mayor,
and Bexley, of course.
Mr. Mayor, you are just being political. We are here to talk about the budget, but if you want to be political, you know full well I'm a Harrow councillor. If you saw the shocking state the Labour administration left us with, then you would have understanding of how we need to deal with
What
things.
about Havering? Let's go to Havering.
Right. Let's pull this back to some order. Where are we? What we have is there's investment in school meals in primary school. EYFS and Key Stage 1 currently has investment from government. The proposal is that the City Hall steps in for a year to fund Key Stage 2. I think it's a really interesting proposal. There were some interesting questions about how that can be paid for in terms of capital expenditure to some of those kitchens. That's interesting because I know there was some challenge with that when the original stuff was brought in back in 2010. These are reasonable questions for a Budget Performance Committee, and we'll get back to reasonableness. So,
that wasn't the question I was asked.
Wait, Mr. Mayor.
Here he
I
goes
understand,
again.
Assembly Member
This
Hall,
is the
have you
impartial
finished?
Conservative chair.
For now.
Right. So, Assembly Member Pidgeon, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. It's a really interesting proposal that you've put into the budget. Could you clarify, in terms of your funding, government fund school meals at £2.42 per meal. Many contractors currently charge £2.53, so there's already a gap. What's the funding assumption per meal in your budget figure that you've come up with, please?
So we've been speaking to the London Carers Association, whose figures are more generous than the agreement with the government. So the government figures aren't the ones you've said. They're less than that. But I can send you the figures we have. But we spoke to those at the Local Authority Carers Association in relation to the figure to use. And it's using their figure and working with them, which is industry standard rather than government standard. We came to the figure, and that's more than the government's own estimate. And that will meet the target of 270,000 primary school children in the capital receiving a free school meal. But I can give you the exact figure we've used. We've used a band in between the two rates we've been given.
Do you have it to hand? I see David Galley's going through the paperwork, because I know some boroughs, whilst welcoming this, just worried a little bit about that funding difference, and some schools are as well.
You can find the figure and write to you.
Yeah. Can I just make the point, Assembly Member, that I made a few minutes ago, which is that in setting the total budget, we were very cautious on uptake. We assumed, frankly, a far higher uptake than there will be in practice, and that provides some contingency against inflationary costs in terms of the cost of an individual meal. So that we've been cautious in that
It would be really useful to see that breakdown. And then obviously you've had questions about capital, and I know that is a big issue. And I remember that from the first phase when infant schools had it, and then across Southwark where I live, where it was rolled out. Have you allowed any capital alongside the revenue that schools would be able to bid for?
In relation to the £130 million we've set aside.
Yeah, is there any separate capital pot alongside this just to help with some of these investments that are going to be needed in kitchens for some schools?
Those are the conversations we're having with London councils, who obviously are very excited by, including Lib Dem ones, I hasten to add.
Oh, absolutely.
In relation to this policy. And so I'm confident that we'll be able to deliver this by September.
Yeah, no, I'm not worried about your confidence. I just wanted to know factually, is there any ring-fence capital pot that can help support this exciting policy initiative?
It's a technical accounting point, but it's not something that we could provide capital funding on, I understand, because it's not our asset. If you think about TfL, and Borough Road, Borough Roads and bridges, so forth. Remember how TfL, it's a capital asset that the borough owns in terms of the bridge or the road, whatever it is. But TfL has to provide revenue funding to support that. They can't provide capital funding because it's not their asset. And so the same thing is going to apply to any spend on school kitchens. So it would be out of that revenue. And what about, you've said you've spoken to the boroughs, which is great. And I was aware of this last week, talking to one of the borough leaders who'd heard about this idea coming. But what about academy trusts? Because they're so key in London since the rollout of academies. Have you been working with some of the big trusts in London as well?
In answer to one of the previous questions I was asked, I did mention schools. So we're speaking to councils, schools, the Caterers Association and other key stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful clarity, and I look forward to just getting that extra detail. In terms of this being one-off, it's 1 year only. Are you looking to, in the future, have this as an annual expenditure? I mean, obviously this is something the government probably ought to be picking up, but they're not, and you're stepping in here. But is this something that you would be looking to then fund in subsequent years?
I think one step at a time. I've been quite clear in relation to what I said yesterday, and also in relation to what we've set out in the budget. And the question asked by Senator Hirani about one-off sums and recurring sums. This is a one-off sum, and I'm sure the Executive Director of Resources would want to make sure that's quite clear in relation to the budget. And so we'll have to wait and see what the position is in future years and future priorities. I've been quite clear in relation to additional monies we've got in over the last few weeks. The two priorities that the additional monies are seeking to address, is addressing the cost of living crisis, and of course in relation to issues around safety and trust and confidence and those sorts of issue. The reason why this emergency scheme is so timely is because of the cost of living crisis, and as you'll appreciate, in September, as we autumn going into winter, that's when families will really feel the pressure and stuff. We'll have to wait and see what the position is in future years in relation to cost of living crisis, but also in relation to our budgets and priorities that I may have this time next year.
The other key thing is making sure schools are still able to collect the free school meal data in order that they can get the pupil premium and other funding from government. I know that has been a challenge in some boroughs.
Which ones? Because the five boroughs, the five boroughs.
Southwark, I know well. I'm a parent.
Southwark, I was in touch with Lydia yesterday, who is a really good example of a good council, a brilliant council, delivering universal free school meals. We're working closely with the five boroughs that we know have got experience in relation to this issue. And that's why, again, some of the scare stories last night about pupil premium being lost just aren't true in relation to those five boroughs and so forth. But listen, we're going to have people who oppose this, finding ways to oppose it, whether it's in relation to the abilities of kitchens to provide the foods or whatever. It's a Trojan horse because they oppose the universality of free school meals, but I know the Lib Dem councils are very excited about this and will be working with us to make it a success.
I'm not quite sure that point. I was just asking a practical question. It's learning from those boroughs to make sure you can keep collecting that data so other funding. It's nothing to do with challenging your policy, which I've said is welcome. And I think it's a really interesting idea, and it's very bold. And it's, as I said, I think government should be in this space, and they're clearly not. The other question I wanted to ask you is in terms of this. When you're presented on the Monday with a number of options, things that were on the books, obviously this was one of the big ones and very exciting. What other things were in there? And did it include the amendment suggestions from the London Assembly and other things the Assembly may have suggested through our work?
Depends which ones in specific do you mean?
In the paper that you were presented with on the Monday, well, the amendment that was passed, which added additional funding into scrappage and into bus services, was that in there for you to consider? And anything else the Assembly's done, your officers may have looked at recommendations we've made at various committees?
No, I have seen the amendments. I chose free school meals over your amendment.
Okay, but the amendment came out of other funding?
And I'm sure we'll come into the use of reserves, and we have David Gallagher here to explain his advice in relation to reserves. More than happy to have a conversation now if you want.
No, you're right, it's coming up later. We'll leave it there. Thank you.
That's fine. And that amendment was put in before we knew about the extra money as well. So it's interesting that your amendment was rejected for a policy they didn't yet have.
Well, Chair, did you vote for that amendment?
Second?
Did you vote for that amendment?
I didn't, no.
Oh, okay.
No. Which explained at the time, because we
it's
talked
not
about
politics, though, is it?
Do you want to do a dance, sing a song? What are you up to?
I'm trying to entertain the children because the chair's quite boring, isn't he?
So Caroline Russell, thank you.
Thank you. And can we just wave to the children because they have just come in and we are talking
Peter, give them a wave, you
about
curmudgeon.
free
Turn
school
around,
meals.
wave to the kids.
So it's very good that we have children in our audience. So,
sorry, Assembly Member, did you just call me a joke?
Oh, Peter, stop being a joker. Stop taking yourself so seriously. There are children here watching you act like a curmudgeon. Smile and give them a wave. Come on.
Mr. Mayor, I think everyone on this committee would appreciate it if you were to behave in the manner of your office and stop trying to make cheap digs at people.
Chair, do you mean everyone? Do you mean everyone? Or do you mean Conservatives?
Speaking. People are asking questions in a respectful way, and we would appreciate it if you would answer them accordingly. Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. I'm almost minded to suggest we all have a minute's silence to collect our thoughts, but I won't. I'll
Good
keep
morning,
going.
Caroline. It's lovely to see you.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. Now, I just have one quick follow-up question on the free school meals, which I absolutely welcome. And I know from the work that happened in Islington when free school meals came in that there are lots of solutions to the capital issues that have been rightly being raised by colleagues. So hopefully it'll all be sorted by September. My question is the boroughs that already provide free school meals, so Islington, Southwark, Newham, Tower Hamlets and Westminster, are they going to be able to claim some money, and are there going to be any restrictions on what that money can be spent on?
Well, thank you for your question and your comments. I know the Labour, Green and Lib Dems across London support this policy, and I look forward to working with them to make it a success. Some are wishing this to fail, and we know why. Some of those are on this committee, but they won't succeed in this failing. And so you're spot on in relation to concern that was identified in relation to, I think Caroline referred to the pupil premium. And apologies, I was answering a different question to the one you asked, is because because of that's the fore of our mind. How do we avoid inadvertently either those children who benefit from free school meals because their family household income is below £7,400 not receiving that benefit and what goes with that, but also those councils have done the right thing because they've been able to afford to do so, and all the rest of it, not losing out in this money we've been able to do. And we're having those conversations with the councils, you'll be pleased to know, and we'll want them to receive the monies that they're due, and we'll be talking with them about how to use that money. In an ideal world, and I don't want to tie anybody's hands, in an ideal world we want the additional money they'll receive, which they will receive, to be used for things to help children, rather than other issues. You'll appreciate, nor would I want to tie the hands of the councils in relation to saying you must do this, you must do that. The good news is none of those councils are in that space. It's a really collegiate conversation about things they could do. Hopefully, the prize is it meets both our objectives, City Hall's objectives and the council's objectives, and I think we can get there.
Excellent, thank you. I look forward to hearing more about the detail of that, but it's good to have reassurance that they're not going to be left out. So my other question is about Transport Services Funding Reserve. You've got £100 million in there, and there was an amendment that went to the last Assembly budget meeting, which put forward a clear proposal to install more toilets across the TfL network for just £20 million. Age UK and other people are calling for this investment. They wrote to you on the 8th of February, and they told you that in TfL's 2022 public consultation, Shaping the Future of Step-Free Access on the Tube, 79% of public respondents said that having access to toilets at tube stations was either important or extremely important to them. So TfL's own consultation shows how strongly Londoners feel about the importance of access to toilets. Why aren't you investing in more toilets?
So, Karen, thanks for this point. Just firstly, those figures that you've said aren't figures that TfL have provided me with. Their figures are very different to the ones you've said. There are three things I just want to say in response to that. Firstly, I have the fore of my mind, and it's a big concern I have, is from next year we get not a penny of revenue support from the government, and we can have no certainty in relation to passenger numbers next April. That means when you've got a £10 billion public transport authority, us having to make ends meet is a real concern we've got. You'll also be aware that we've got to make savings of £600 million, bring in revenues of £500 million, and so the transport reserve is really important in relation to our lack of ability to go to the government for support. Secondly, the experience I've had from the water fountains is it's often not as straightforward as you think, and that's a water fountain versus a loo. And you'd have thought water fountain is really easy to do. It really isn't. It's a nightmare in relation to pipes going there, maintenance, the right sorts of skills, so forth. So the figure you said of £20,000 is not the figure that TfL have given us, which is
20 million.
Between 100 and 500,000, depending on where the location is and the station is, and all the rest of it. That's before you get to maintenance. You'll all be aware that this is really important to public transport users because you've been assiduous about raising this issue, and the report I've read from the GLA. So we simply can't agree with the figures that you say, which if it works those figures, obviously the TfL will be looking into this. But TfL have got, priority stations in relation to the issue of loos, and I've set out in previous plenaries what those priorities are. Step-free access, multimodal stations, so forth, and we keep this under review.
Okay, is there someone in particular that I should be speaking to at TfL to learn a bit more about the costings of this?
What I can do is organise a meeting with you offline, and my office will be in touch to organise that.
That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Tsai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to the panel. Mr. Mayor, if I can ask you this, just looking at the big picture. We talked about processes at some length, but it's the big picture that I'm concerned about with your budget. So Londoners face multiple pressures, some of which you already talked about: cost of living crisis, inflation, interest rates, mortgage payments. How does your budget help Londoners with these pressures, and what additional support, if any, has been made available by the government?
Thank you very much. So we've had a number of asks from the government to help families with the cost of living crisis in London. One of the big asks was to freeze private rents for 2 years. That would save the average private renter £3,000. The government said so far declined our request for that. The second big request we had was for universal credit, the £20 emergency universal credit to be brought back. The government said no to that, but there's a budget coming up soon. We keep our fingers crossed for that. And the third big ask was universal free school meals. Again, nothing from the government. The reason why it's important in relation to the universal free school meals is, although there are some families who receive free school meals, your household income needs to be below £7,400 after tax, irrespective of the number of children you have. So the Child Poverty Action Group calculate that there are more than 210,000 children in London living in poverty not eligible for free school meals. And we estimate our universal free school meals offer from September will mean that every family with a child will benefit to the tune of £440 per child. That is a game changer for many London families that you mentioned in your question. You've got 2-3 kids, we're talking about £1,200 extra in your pocket, which will help you with, for example, fuel bills. Again, we've asked the government for a lifeline tariff or to extend the energy windfall for post-April. So the extra money from the free school meals being applied universally will help those families address the issues the government's unwilling to address.
Very practical measures. So, Mr. Mayor, coming to the issue of free school meals, I was going to ask you this later on, but it's already been raised, so I might as well ask you now. Firstly, can I welcome this? I think it's an excellent initiative, especially in the current cost of living crisis climate. And I was the Newham councillor in 2009 when we introduced the country's first free school meals program, along with Islington and I think Sadiq. And it went down really well. It saved a family with 2 children something like £667 a year. Today, I think we're talking about £880 for a family with 2. And what it did do, Mr. Mayor, what it did do was remove the stigmatization associated with families with low income. And that's why I think the universality of it was so very welcome then and is now. So I just want to ask you a sort of general question more about the benefits of free school meals. Back in 2009, in 2011, the Department of Education did a pilot of universal free school meals and found that in the 2 years between 2009 to 2011, that providing free school meals had a significant positive impact on people's educational attainment. Do you anticipate other benefits as a result of this policy?
Yes, very important question. We are keen to evaluate the difference universal free school meals makes. What we know from the evidence in some Scandinavian countries, Finland's a good example, but also examples from the boroughs you refer to, and there are a number of members here who've served in those great boroughs doing good stuff in relation to universal free school meals, is it leads to better concentration for the children, which means higher educational attainment, better mental health, better physical health, and actually better productivity. PwC did a piece of work at the cost of universal free school meals, and then the benefits of universal free school meals in relation to the issues I've mentioned: educational attainment, mental health being better, physical health being better, less of a burden on the NHS, plus better productivity when they get into the work stream, and there's a net benefit of the billions of pounds. During the course of 23-24, the academic year, we will be evaluating the difference universal free school meals make, so we can show not just the difference in the pocket of the families you're talking about, in the purse of the family you're talking about, but also the wider benefits to society of free school meals being available to everyone in primary school.
And finally, Mr. Mayor, coming to policing, so the Commissioner told this committee that his service is significantly underfunded today compared to 2010/11. MPS staff numbers, there's a police service staff numbers have been reduced by around 1,000 since 2013. To what extent is the government trying to run frontline services like the Metropolitan Police Service on a shoestring funding and leaving council tax to plug the gaps?
Well, what the government's doing is what's called cost shunting, where they are pulling central government money from public services and placing the costs of those on regional and local government. And council tax is a regressive tax. Speak to all the experts from the IFS to the Resolution Foundation. They'll explain how regressive it is. But I'll give you the police as an example. In 2016-17, we saw the consequences of not raising the police precept to the maximum the government allowed you to do so. They penalised us to the tune of £30 million that year. And every year, we're £30 million light because of a decision made by the previous mayor. Over 8 years, you can do the maths, it's £240 million down from what we would have had. Had we not increased the police precept, for example, to £10, is it 50? So £15, as the government said to us we had to do before referendum, would have been penalised this year in relation to central government grant, Home Office grant, but also in subsequent years as well in relation to what we received in subsequent years. 2 basic sources of funding: council tax and Home Office grant for the baseline. And that's why we had to, once the government said there's a £10, £15, beg your pardon, police precept, we had to go there, because if we didn't go there, we'd be penalised. And I think all police and crime commissioners across the country have done the same.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay, thank you. I'm just mindful that we're jumping around the agenda here a little bit, so some colleagues are having toes stepped on. Just be mindful of that when we're looking at our questions. I'm going to move to TfL now, Mr. Mayor. Again, as I set out right at the beginning of this meeting, we're talking about the differences from the previous budget and performance meeting to the current budget and performance meeting. And something we know now that we didn't know then is about the fare increase. So there's an extra 81 million in passenger income for TfL. Can you talk us through how this extra income is going to be used?
Or just remind me, Chair, the difference, how you get to the figure?
So we've got 5.9%
the
fare
percentage increase, you mean?
Yeah, percentage increase, yeah.
So if I mean, with your permission, I'll ask the Chief of Staff to come in, because the short answer is the business plan put in 4% with the deal with the government. Anything between 4% and 5.99% goes to the government as part of the deal. It's not a criticism, it's just the way the deal was done. Had we gone below 5.99, we'd have got less money from the government and we'd have found it elsewhere. Does that make sense?
I read that through in the papaperwork, so I get that. Yeah.
So
it's just about the allocation of...
Exactly. So my understanding is that this additional money, I don't recognise the figure you said. I thought it was 83, but maybe 81.
Okay.
The additional money goes to DFT rather than to us.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. And so then is there anything built into the future then in terms of fare increase that will have an impact on income over the next 3 or 4 years, or will that all be consumed in the same place? Because presumably, and I defer to your better knowledge here, there'll be a fluctuation on that percentage increase, won't there?
So, trying to just understand your question, obviously TfL in its business plan has an assumption as about what the increase will be. Its assumption from memory is for March 24 is 4%, which was consistent with the assumption that we had for March 23. I'll explain why in a second. And then thereafter, they've gone back to their traditional planning assumption of RPI +1, which, as we know, is the way they plan. It doesn't mean that the mayor of the day who takes the decision on an annual basis is going to do that. That's the planning assumption they choose to use. And coming back to your point, to the point about the 4%, so we're in a situation where the funding agreement with government is in effect till the end of March 2024. Yeah. Now, the annual fare increase, as we all know, used to take effect at the very start of January each year. Yeah. Now that got pushed back because a couple of years ago in the pandemic, a lot was going on. I'm not saying this in a critical way, but DFT didn't have their act together and just weren't ready, and so that's shifted round now to happening in March. And that's obviously another little thing that, to your theme, Chair, about our budget process, in the time pre-pandemic, the Mayor would be asked to take the annual decision about fares probably in about the middle of November, and so we would then reflect that in the TfL business plan that comes out at about that point, in the consultation budget, and then in the processes, so we would know. Because the government has moved that, and because the national rail fare increase and the TfL fare increase have to be aligned and happen together, that means that we don't have that transparency in the budget process. And so looking to the point about next year, what's interesting is that, so there's nothing fixed about when the annual increase will happen. This year it's the first Sunday in March, so quite probably will be next year, but it might not be. That's very much in DFT's gift. If it is, it happens on, let's say, early March. The funding agreement, which obviously has this, has these rules about the mayoral decision about fare increases within it, applies until the 31st of March. So you're going to have this window of a few weeks where we're still within the constraint that applied within this year's decision.
Okay, I think I followed most of that, but to just have another swing then, the 5.9% increases that baseline income, doesn't it, for TfL? So that's going to be baked in over the next few years, even when the new time or the new application of percentage increases is applied. So there is a profit element built into the next few years, depending on what happens to the economy and inflation and things like that sorting itself out. Is that a right assessment? David, I saw you nod. David Galley, I saw you nod.
So when you get to 24-25, yes, obviously the 5.9% is baked into the fares and continues forever.
Yeah.
Obviously, what happens to fare income in 24-25 is very uncertain, given the economic picture we're in at the moment.
Yeah. David, did you want to add something? I saw you. No. Okay. But that is baked into those future years. Okay, that's just really interesting for future reference. Caroline Pidgeon I saw next. Or was it Caroline Russell? I knew it was going to go wrong on this section. Caroline Russell.
Yes, just very briefly about the flexibility for setting fares. I'm really concerned about sort of where that flexibility can be used for concessions and free travel, and that we do as much as possible. So what investigations have you done to look into extending free travel to other low-paid workers, like contractors, all across the GLA functional bodies, in the ways that you have for TfL staff?
So we've done some work in relation to key sector workers when it comes to allocation of intermediate housings. We've got quite a good idea now who are the key sectors, because if you remember the policy I announced more than a year ago, to ensure those who worked so hard during the pandemic, nurses, so forth, can benefit from allocation of housing that we're supporting. And so we're now in a quite good place to know the very care workers, nurses, so forth. There's a whole list now that we've worked with the councils, trade unions and others to draw up. And so one of the things we were able to do is to I was able to announce that all of those who work for contractors that do work on the underground would benefit from free travel. I'd already announced previously they get free travel in between stations, as well as a London living wage. But I was able to announce the lowest paid workers who work indirectly for TfL/LU were able to receive free travel going to and from work. That applies ostensibly to cleaners, security and caterers. Because of the requirement in the contract for us to provide additional revenues of £500 million this year, plus make savings of £600 million over and above the £1.1 billion, the advice from the TfL CFO and just doing the number crunching was it simply is not possible for us in the short term to medium term to look into that. Another suggestion you had, which I looked into, was the idea of, for example, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but freezing bus fares, because the poorest people use bus fares, and maybe increasing the fares elsewhere. So we're still under the umbrella of 5.99%. I'm just for shorthand using. And again, the problem with that, and I did look into that as well, was the increases in the tubes to freeze the fares in the buses would have been humongous. I'll give you a couple of examples. So as it is, we've managed to only increase bus fares by 10p, still the cheapest in the country. What we've done is we've now got a new off-peak Zone 1 fare, £2.70, to help, as you'll appreciate, poor Londoners always use the tube. It's not the case that only poor Londoners use the bus and well-off use the tube. So within Zone 1, we've increased it by more. So we increased it by 30p within Zone 1 travel, because the calculation is more tourist and probably better off. Coming from outside to Zone 1, the increase has been far less. Had we frozen bus fares and paid for it by the tube fares, those increases would have been far bigger. But we did look into that at your suggestion, and the figures were just too big.
Okay, so when I have this meeting with someone from TfL about toilet costs, would it be possible to also look at just have a bit more of, so that I don't take this meeting down that rabbit hole, but would it be possible to have a meeting with someone to really understand that in detail, so that we don't put forward a suggestion that won't work?
What I'm happy to do is have a separate meeting. It really is very separate skill set. A separate meeting what I'll organise for you to meet the Fairs team, who can just do some wonderful things with numbers if you give to them.
Thank you, that would be really helpful.
Thank you. Now it's Caroline Pidgeon.
Lovely, thank you. I wanted to pick up the issue of funding for bus routes, extra bus routes that's in your budget. An extra 33 million for bus routes in inner London, which I think is reversing the potential cuts, and then 6 million for buses in outer London. How did you decide these figures, and can you talk us through where these additional services will be in outer London, how you plan to allocate that? Perhaps to the Mayor, really.
Yeah, can I just start on the factual point, and then
sure.
the Mayor can talk on the policy point. So as you rightly say, so there's £33 million, which is the cost of, and it's actually building up to 33 million, of not taking away some of the services in inner London. But then the other point about the 6 million, so there are two things here that I think are the risk of getting conflated. So the TfL budget already provides for 1 million extra kilometres in outer London. Yeah? And then what the Mayor did in the draft budget is provide £6 million for a further 1 million kilometres. Now, they're quite likely to be largely in outer London, but they may not be entirely in outer London. So when the Mayor talks about the sort of things that TfL are looking at, it's those two packets together, so it's not all going to be about outer London.
Thanks, David. And just to help you, Caroline, just at that point, so for 23-24, of the £33 million, £10 million goes towards the buses, 24-25, £28 million, 25-26, £33 million. We're not going to make any cuts to the ones that we have already announced. So in relation to, there are two separate 1 million kilometres. So the first 1 million kilometres is just outer London, and I'll come to that in a second. More work's done on that one. The second 1 million kilometres is outer London and some inner and some central. For the second tranche, there isn't as much detail I can give you yet, but I'm more than happy to engage with you in relation to that as we work them through. We're having really good conversations with key stakeholders across the city in relation to the second tranche. In relation to the first tranche, what we're going to do is have a million additional kilometres of buses by this August. That is the biggest expansion of buses our city's ever seen in such a short period of time.
And that's specifically out of London.
So the first 1 million kilometres has to be out of London.
London, yeah, absolutely.
Some of that could be, though, an extension of a bus that currently stops in London, if you see what I mean. So I'm not saying these are all new routes in outer London.
No, I get that, yeah.
And some of it could also be, one of the things that I think you raised, apologies, Caroline, if it wasn't you, it may have been the other Caroline, is frequency. I remember one of you raised an issue.
Frequency, I raised, yes. Right. I was going to come on to that in a minute, yeah.
So some of the issues is, look, I'll give you an example. So rather than having a bus in outer London for the first time that comes, twice an hour, actually you're better off improving, having more frequency of a bus and extending the route. It's your point. I think you made. I think you gave me an example of a route last time. I can't remember the number it was. So the numbers I can confirm we've now got, because I thought that you may ask about the 1 million kilometres, is I can give you some numbers if you like and areas. Route 180. Which is, I think, affects Erith, Lewisham 129, 472 Abbey Wood, 330 Pontoon Dock, 497 Dagenham Park Square, 241 Royal Wharf. All these are examples of extensions of routes. The phrase uses significant enhancements. That can mean one or two things, right? The other area which we've talked about is frequencies being improved, then extended, and lengthening the hours, I beg your pardon, of the operation. 376 W4 H28 A10, and also there's now a new route called 304 in East London. These are all outer London, by the way. I'm not focusing on anything. And there are targeted enhancements for Route 95, which is Southall Green Quarter. I've got to declare an interest as I shop here. Battersea Power Station 211, Olympic Park 339, and Wandsworth Riverside 485. And just the next bit is going to be just TBC. But if you remember, there are large developments in outer London. We don't want the buses starting before the development's got people living there. But just if you also pencil in, there's developments in Barnet, Brent Cross, Ealing, Alperton, Harrow, Eastman Village, and Haringey Heartlands. There's no point in a bus starting. If I say the bus is going to start in June, but the development doesn't open until August, so just that's the question mark. And I'm happy to come back to you and colleagues in relation to the second tranche, which I mentioned in answer to.
That's really helpful. If we could have that detail in writing as well. I've scribbled down numbers, but that would be helpful. Now, at our meeting in January, you mentioned a little bit of this, and you talked about 2 new bus routes in Sutton. Wondering, do you have those details?
I did ask that question last night. I'm more than happy. The answer is probably I'm happy to give. I've got back. Yeah.
if that could come through later, I'd be interested to know. The route I'd raised with you at one of our budget...
I think that's a big one. I think it's linked with the hospital as well, the great news in the hospital as well. So I'm going to go back to you.
The cancer centre, yeah. The bus 213 I raised with you previously, because you're cutting this goes between Kingston and Sutton, you're cutting the frequency of it, by about 90,000 kilometres a year. That's the plan at the moment. Are you going to change that? Because it seems really perverse with what you're planning in Outer London be reducing frequencies.
Yeah, when you mentioned this, I don't know all the bus routes by heart, but when you mentioned this, I did think a bit odd, and I did have an answer which I forgot what it was, but I agree with you. It seems nonsensical to be reducing frequencies. Can I come back to you on that as well, please?
That would be really helpful. Thank you. I think I'll leave it.
It's also Outer London, which is...
I think you've got a big policy happening, ULEZ, which we'll come on to in the summer. We want to be incentivising people, and it would be great if we could have that.
Understood, loud and clear.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. I think that's all on this.
Thank you. Just for my clarity, did you talk about those new bus routes by August? What was the date? August?
I said 1 million kilometres of additional bus routes by August 23.
That's very ambitious.
I like to be.
No, it is very ambitious. Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I think, Mr Mayor, you answered quite a lot of the questions I had about buses, but I do have a few more. In terms of the planning for the first tranche, what is the process? Who is leading on it? Is that Jeff Hobbs at TfL? And are you discussing, are you talking to the boroughs, are you talking to stakeholders? How are you planning these, this additional provision?
Well, as you know, TfL has got a very sophisticated engagement consultation process. I'm more than happy to do you a short note to reassure you about how the consultation is taking place.
That would be useful. And if people, I have constituents who are contacting me with suggestions. You've got a second tranche as well, so
now's the time to do that. Yeah. Please.
No worries. And Caroline Pigeon mentioned the 213 as a frequency reduction. We've received a number of emails around frequency reductions from TfL over the last few months, and a lot of them are in Outer London. 213 is one example. H32 is another example in the Southall area. You said you would look at the 213. Can I take that pledge to be looking at all the recent frequency reduction announcements for buses in Outer London as a whole, not just the 213?
Yeah, would you mind just dropping me an email today to let me know what the routes you've been? I mean, some of there's a very good reason why frequencies have been reduced. I mean, listen, TfL wants the money's in from passengers using our buses, right? But often it's because of a lack of passengers that the frequencies go down, and it's a chicken and egg. You would say in response, not unreasonably, well, if you have less frequency, don't be surprised if fewer people use the buses. So if you wouldn't mind, Nick, just emailing me today the buses you're asking about, and I can take that away.
Yeah, no problem at all. I think, Chair, that's it for my buses questions, but I have some later. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a consultation process for new bus routes?
Yes.
There is. What's the length of that consultation process?
Oh, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But it's a significant process driven by statute.
Okay. All right. Caroline Pigeon.
Yes, just back to me on buses. How does the increased bus costs impact the operating envelope as set out in the 30th of August TfL funding settlement? And does this have any funding implications?
So, what the funding agreement provides for is that the Mayor is able to, basically, the funding agreement is based on the services that TfL were providing, and if the Mayor wants to, make additions to those, then the Mayor needs to, transparently provide the funding for that, and that's why the Mayor's been transparent about both the 33 million to stop the widespread closures that were consulted on largely in inner London, and the extra £6 million that he's providing to do the second 1 million kilometres.
So there's no funding implications. You just have to be transparent and clear where the funding's coming from.
It's a funding implication in that the Mayor has to provide it.
Yes.
It can't come out of the TfL budget itself.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine. That's clear. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're back to Assembly Member Rogers at this point.
Thank you. Mr Mayor, ULEZ expansion, it's now subject to legal challenge. What would the budgetary consequence be of any delay or change to the ULEZ plans?
Well, you'll appreciate, I mean, I've been mayor now for for 7 years, take minus a few weeks, and I've experienced many legal challenges TfL as did the previous mayor. So there's always legal challenges when you run a public transport authority like TfL. So what you don't do is work on the basis you're going to lose a legal challenge. You work on the basis that the plans that we have will go ahead. So there aren't any plans about the consequences to the budget of those 5 Conservative councillors succeeding in their judicial review.
So you've no contingency plans for if the case is lost?
If the councils win, no.
Okay. And have you taken any action at all? So no pausing of rollouts, no pausing of procurement, nothing like that at all?
No.
No. Okay, excellent. And talking of procurement, we've talked about this before. I asked whether, I think it was back in December, whether cameras were already going up. You said you'd be surprised if they were. Has that changed now? And if not, what's the sort of the timetable looking like?
Oh, there they are. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The process is happening. The rollout has been happening initially on TfL owned roads, and then we're working obviously with boroughs and going through the appropriate processes with them for the rollout following there.
Thank you. And in terms of the procurement process for the cameras, do you know when that started?
I don't know.
Would you be able to find out for me, please, and write to me?
I'm sure we can pick that up in the usual way. Chair.
Thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Thank you. Not only when the procurement started, it'd be interesting to know where they were procured from as well. So where they manufactured, all that sort of stuff as well. That'd be very useful. So we're moving now to Caroline Pidgeon. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just pick up, because I think it probably fits there, as you were just talking about the ULEZ expansion. Obviously, we had an amendment passed by the Assembly that put more money into scrappage. At the January committee, you estimated you probably need 180 million for scrappage. Do you want to explain why you rejected that, and why, given there's extra money and that you've decided not to put further money into scrappage?
Well, the 180 million pounds you talk about is over 3 years. So it's 60 million pounds a year. We always keep these things under review, contrary to what's been said in the media. And so, look, the reality is, when we first announced the scrappage scheme for Central London, people were saying it should be higher. Then we increased it. They said it should be higher. Then we increased it again to £6 million, and people said it should be higher. I suspect, even though I've announced an additional £110 million, had I said 130, you'd have said it should be higher than that. So that's politics, and I get that. And we'll keep these things under review, but we're nowhere near getting to the £110 million that's currently being allocated. That is a very generous scheme, the most generous of its kind in the country. Even though we've got not a penny of support, unlike Bristol, Bath and Portsmouth, it is generous. But I always keep these things under review. But at this stage, we think it's enough. And you'll be aware, it's not a political point. In central in London, we managed to support a number of families, businesses, sole traders with the £6 million. We think this is a huge amount, and we'll keep it under review.
Okay, thank you for that.
And just to follow up and make the other point, which is that, in terms of the amendment and looking at things like the Transport Funding Reserve, as was said earlier, TfL faces very real financial risks. I think we touched on the fares side of things, economy on the brink of a recession. Probably didn't touch on the the inflationary pressures that TfL faces, and the judgment about keeping that reserve there is to help us if those risks materialise, because what we absolutely don't want to be in a situation is where we're cutting bus routes, pushing TfL back towards managed decline, because that's the reality we face when the government operational funding ceases, if we don't have the revenues that we expect. And that's why it's important to be prudent and to keep that money available in the case that comes to pass.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on to your decision around the 60+ and older persons freedom pass. How will you look to support low-income households that are impacted by this decision of yours? And clearly, we've seen research from Age UK London where they talk about actually how people use it. Some of it is for hospital appointments, but some of it, as we know, is for caring, whether it's helping out with looking after grandchildren or caring for other loved ones. So perhaps you could talk us through your thinking around that.
Well, firstly, Caroline, I mean, you've been consistent in relation to universal benefits for those above the age 60 and universal free school meals. Some people here want to have universal free travel for above the age of 60, but don't want universal free school meals for children. Funny that, isn't it? But I recognise it's a big problem for those who have hospital appointments. And so what Seb Dance, the Deputy Mayor, has done is he's written to hospitals across London, GPs and so forth, to ask them to make appointments later on. What's happening was, you're spot on, appointments at 9 o'clock, 9:15, 9:30, 10, and not unreasonably those above the age of 60 will even before 9 o'clock using the free travel. Now they've got to pay for the travel between 4:30 a.m. and 9 a.m. and having problems. So we've asked hospitals and doctors to make appointments later on in the day rather than shortly after 9 a.m. It was part of the negotiation with the government in relation to the point they were making is other people across the country haven't got this, what you've got in London. I was quite clear. What I wasn't willing to do was to every year delay the eligibility. So one of the proposals, you remember, Caroline, was, so at the moment it's 6-year-olds receive it. For argument's sake, from next year, those who've got it is fine, but you've got to be 61 before you receive it, and then in a couple of years you've got to be. That's another proposal. So I've paid for that not to happen. Part of the £33 million goes towards paying for that not to happen, but we simply couldn't bring back 4:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. I think TfL are going to write to you in relation to the cost to TfL. It's the tens of millions of pounds, and every pound we've had to spend there is money we have to take elsewhere. David's referred to some of the, Hobson's choices, bus routes being cut and so forth. So the decision was made to keep it as we have it, and we're trying to do what we can to mitigate the consequences for those. Dial Ride continues to, serve older Londoners, but it is the case, I'm afraid, that we weren't able to bring back the free travel for those above the age of 60 between 4:30 a.m. and 9 a.m.
Okay, and you said part of the 33 million. What was the exact cost of the decision to cancel the increase in age eligibility?
We have got that somewhere, Caroline.
It's a difficult one because obviously, as the Mayor explained, the proposal that we were forced to put together to meet the government's funding conditions, it was an incremental one, and so it's complicated, but we're basically using, for the business plan period, I believe it's £28 million that enables that process.
But obviously it's more in future years. Obviously, if so, for argument's sake, it's for next year it would have been hypothetically between 60 and 61. That's the saving. Yes. In subsequent years, it's 2 years, and so obviously in X years' time, it's a big number. That's why David's been a bit cautious with the number he's given you.
And also because there still was a debate to have at the precise. Do you increase it by 1 year every year, 9 months every year, 6 months every year? There were options that TfL were looking at, so it's hard to give concrete figures and say this is exactly it, but that's the impact across the business plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hall, did I see you indicate?
Yes, you did. Sorry, can you just clarify this? You've just told Assembly Member Pigeon that you can't mess around with or give the pensioners pass, the Freedom Pass, the extra half an hour because it would cost millions of pounds. Sorry, is that what you said?
It's between 4:30 a.m. and 9 a.m.
Yeah.
That's the period.
No, I get that, but when I ask, when I say that we should stop giving nominee passes to TfL, I've been told on numerous occasions that it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't cost anything for nominee passes. So why does it cost nothing for nominee passes, or a negligible amount, I think I've been told. We've been told all sorts of things, but basically that it doesn't cost anything, which I would argue against, because I actually do agree that the Freedom Passes, of course they cost something. But why is it different that Freedom Passes are too expensive for you to look at, which I understand the finances? I have never understood the argument you give me that nominee passes, and just for anybody that's watching this, a nominee pass is somebody that works for TfL can give their flatmate or somebody a pass for free to travel on TfL. Why are we told that costs nothing, yet the Freedom Pass costs millions and millions of pounds?
It's about the volume of journeys.
Well, we don't always know what they are. The volume of journeys. I've been told that they've not been logged properly.
Well,
so somebody can have a free pass all the time, and it could be somebody that travels as far, one end of a railway to the other. It could be that they do that every day. How do you know?
So there are 2 points to this.
Yeah.
The first point is, there are clearly far fewer people who would have a nominee pass than would have a freedom pass.
How many people have got nominee passes?
There are about 19,000 in circulation, but a number of those will go to people who actually live out, TfL staff and their partners who live outside London, and therefore they would use it very infrequently, whereas obviously the Freedom Pass is all people who live in London. So there's a difference there. So it's that scale. The other point that, to connoisseurs of this committee, we get to do this every year, don't we?
We do.
That needs to be made is that the nominee pass is, whatever one's views on it, is a long-standing contractual benefit that TfL staff receive, and if you were to take, you can't unilaterally take away a benefit that people receive, and if you were to try
that's
and,
not what
if
I'm
you were
asking.
to, well, you are, because
No,
if you are,
I know what I'm asking. I'm asking why one costs nothing and the other costs millions.
Because if you took away the nominee pass, I'm trying to. If you take away the nominee pass, then TfL would need to provide their staff with a benefit of equivalent value, and given the number of staff at TfL, that would be much more expensive than the nominee pass, given that the numbers of people are small,
nothing,
and there are very few.
I think I've made my point.
We don't need additional services as a consequence.
Well, it's amazing that one costs absolutely nothing, apparently, and the other one costs millions and millions of pounds. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So I just want to go back to, or pick up, the paper travel card system. Now, it says in the TfL business plan that the Mayor is, published in December 22, that the Mayor is still considering withdrawing from the travel card agreement with the train operating companies. And we understand that there's a risk about the level of complexity of implementation of withdrawing from the paper travel cards, but that there could be cost savings in terms of retailing and selling the tickets and everything around it. So what is your current expectation of the financial impact of the withdrawal by TfL from the travel card system and the impact on passengers?
Sure. So it's just, if we break down the paper travel cards to 4 types: daily, weekly, monthly and annual. Mm-hmm. And so there's a cost associated with each of those. And if I decide not to do some, that means a cost. That means a saving we're not making, if that makes sense. So I'll ask David to go through the numbers, but I think with the daily and the weekly, the consequences, put aside the cost, the consequences are less bad than monthly and annual, because of the alternative, the caps and so forth. But this sort of saving to TfL for doing that. So David, do you want to give some of the numbers?
Yeah. So in terms of the monthly and annual, which actually technically a separate agreement, it turns out, to the daily, the Mayor, we looked at the consequences of removing that and decided the impact on Londoners just, would be, well, it's fair to say the use of those tickets is really going down over time. There are still, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but still a material number of Londoners who use them, and that's why the Mayor's indicated that he doesn't want those to end, and that's why in the budget he's provided recurring £9 million a year, as he needs to fund it, as we said, under the funding agreement, so that the monthly and annual paper travel cards can continue. Mm-hmm. In terms of the the dailies and weeklies, but really it's really about the dailies. That is still a matter to come to the Mayor for decision. TfL is still looking at it. I don't have a precise cost in front of me, but I think it's in the region of about £40 million if you accept that as a very broad ballpark rather than a kind of precise figure.
So what work are you doing on the equalities impact of removing those? Because obviously those, I mean, they're partly used very often by visitors to London, but also people who are less digital.
Yeah, and that's absolutely why we haven't rushed into this, and why, if ultimately TfL, having looked at it, still think it's the way to go and want to formally recommend it to the Mayor, the mayoral decision will go into all those issues and set it out, because obviously, that needs to be looked at. I think actually what you will see is that overwhelmingly this is about people from outside London travelling into London, and it's about their tickets, and not about Londoners who obviously in very high numbers have moved over to using contactless or Oyster already.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose, London, we need our visitors. Our economy depends on our visitors, so making sure that there are systems, if you do decide to remove it, that there is a system that works for those people that do currently still use those paper systems. What is driving you've got, in terms of reserves, you've got 182 million increase in TfL reserves now since the consultation budget. Now, you explained earlier that you need reserves because you're moving beyond the point of having the government temporary COVID support. But can you give us a bit more about how and when you think those reserves are going to be used? Because there's a lot of money sitting there. Just tell us a bit more about those reserves.
Before David comes in, just worth reminding colleagues that we also have the finance facility, because we are so concerned to make sure the TfL CFO wouldn't sign off the not reasonably until he had that reassurance from GLA. So that's a good example of the fragility of TfL finances. And secondly, of course, and Caroline Pigeon touched upon this, the additional monies we're giving to TfL to keep those buses going in London that we otherwise would have had to cut because of the government condition. But that's the context is really important. Sorry, David.
Yep. Essentially what you're seeing in the changes in reserves is you're just seeing the movements associated with essentially all the things we've been talking about for the last 30, 40 minutes or so that have transpired during the budget process. So, whether it's the bus funding, it's the retention of monthly and annual travel cards, it's the not phasing out the 60-plus pass, it's the fares, etc. And just given the time pressures of the budget process, another theme, essentially TfL are just in their tables, we're just showing those movements there, and then TfL will produce their final budget next month that will start the process of allocating those to individual headings. So there's I've got the precise list in front of me. I could read it out, but I really think it because it's a question I asked myself, and it's the things we've been talking about.
Sorry, when you say the things we've been talking, you mean they are planning to spend those reserves, and they're going to? Have I understood that right? Those reserves are going to be spent, but they'll start allocating that money from next month.
So the one thing why there's a net increase is the point that the chair and I were talking about a while ago around the later year impact of the fare increase being 5.9% when the business plan assumed 4%.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that money at the moment shows in reserves because there's no plan to use it, and that, as the Mayor said, we're very, very mindful of the risks facing TfL, And so that money at the moment is essentially the first line of defence against a downtick in passenger numbers or inflationary impacts being higher than is thought. And so TfL, we will see how things play out in the months ahead, and then in the summer, and when TfL get into their business planning, we will be able to see, well, do we actually need to use that money to keep the TfL budget balanced, or, if not, other options. But it's not, if it weren't there, to be honest with you, I'd have been recommending to the Mayor that we needed more in the Transport Services Reserve because of the risks that TfL face.
So do you have a, so you're saying that this is about protecting TfL's financial viability and protecting against a downtick in fares income, because you're not going to have that government backup support. But you're also saying that you think that you might be able to spend some of that money over these next months. So it's...
No, I didn't say that, to be clear. I emphatically said that we're not going to spend that money, but we're there as we go into the business plan process, which starts in the summer and runs around next year, and we will assess the situation.
Okay.
Now, if passenger numbers boom and we're all going great, and TfL have got control under inflation, well, then you've got more capacity, and there are choices within the business plan about what to do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've seen one or two smiles on committee members' faces. That's clearly, given the state of the economy, etc., that's clearly not something one can assume, and so we just need to wait and see.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm minded that recently we've stopped for a break during question and answer sessions. Are colleagues, are they keen for a break, or would you rather just push through? Push through? Push on? Splendid. Right, so that takes us to the next section, which is lined up for Assembly Member Hall to answer. Assembly Member Hall, you'll recognise with some of those questions we've covered some of it in the past, so I shall leave it to your judgment what to follow up on.
Yeah. But I nevertheless want to go back to the, well, I won't call them free school meals, because obviously nothing in life is free, we all know that. So I've just been in conversation text-wise with officers at Harrow, and nobody has spoken to any officers in Harrow about extending kitchens or whether they have any capacity or anything like that. So how many boroughs have you actually spoken to see if this is an issue?
I'll have to get back to you. We're speaking to London Council, so I'm not on top of every conversation with every council, so we can get back to you on that.
Well, David Bellamy, you know the answer to everything. How many councils have you spoken to?
I don't have anything to add to what the Mayor said. I've not been personally directly involved in those discussions.
You see, this is a worry. If you haven't spoken, I know you haven't spoken to Harrow, if you haven't spoken to over half of your councils, then you don't know what their capacity is. So you make this grand policy, and you grandstand, and all you're happy to do is to say that we're not happy with it, when all we're doing is asking questions on the budget. So would it be right to say you haven't spoken to, say, half of the councils?
Well, Chair, I'm not quite clear how the member goes from texting the leader of the council raising council tax by £83 to saying half the councils.
No, just answer this question, Mayor.
Chair, I'm not quite clear how the member goes from texting the leader of Harrow Council raising council tax by £82.16 and surmises that half the...
The person in charge of children's services. I am asking you, how many councils have you actually asked about this? How many councils have you asked whether this is possible or not? Because actually, although you may feign, desperation and irritation by these questions, they are actually very important. We need to know whether there is the capacity for your plans to come into being.
So I think the Mayor can come in there.
Well, as I said about 4 minutes ago, we've been in close contact with London Council. I'm more than happy to drop the member a note in relation to Harrow Council and the conversations that hadn't been had with them.
So what time are you estimating that you'll know the answer to the capacity issues?
Oh, I know the answer now. We'll be able to serve all primary school kids in London universal free school meals from September. If some councils, for their own reasons, like Harrow, don't want to take up the offer, that's for families in Harrow to raise with Harrow, but I'm confident.
Okay, so supposing other councils, let's say Hillingdon, extremely well-run council, just supposing some councils say to you, it's going to cost, I don't know, let's just pluck it out the air like you often do with figures, 5 million, 10 million, to put in capital costs to enlarge their kitchens in order to deal with this policy. Who's going to incur the costs of increasing the sizes of those kitchens? Are you prepared to do that, or will the borough have to?
Well, Hillingdon Council are raising their council tax by £63 and 4 pence, almost double.
I know you think you're being clever. Just answer the question.
Almost double the amount that GLA are raising council tax by as a consequence of government conditions. We'll be speaking to the councils, schools, the Local Authority Caterers Association. I know, for example, some schools, just from personal experience, where there's issues with kitchen capacity, often the caterers bring the food on site, nutritious, healthy, to be warmed up if that's the case. So the expertise that some of the brilliant councils have that we've talked about, Caroline, the Sadiqs, the Islingtons, the Newhams, the Westminsters, I'm sure can provide expertise to Hillingdon.
Mr. Mayor, who will pick up the bill if they have to extend the kitchens? Who will pick up this capital cost when so many of the councils are really pushed?
Which I think I've gone over this. I don't accept the premise of the assertion. If that eventuality arrives, we can discuss that. But the conversation so far with the London councils, with the Caterers Association, with schools and other partners has been very, very positive.
No, I just want to give comfort to any councils who think, my God, we're not going to be able to do this. We have not the capacity in our kitchens. It's going to cost X, Y, Z. I want them to have the comfort, whether they're Labour or Conservative, Lib Dem, it really makes no difference. I want them to have the comfort of knowing that since you've put this policy in place, that you will cover the capital costs of any adjustments that they need to their kitchens.
It's really important I give reassurance to those Conservative councils who may not want to take up this offer. We won't force them to take up this offer.
I'm talking about all councils. I'm concerned. This is a budget committee, and I want to know just how well worked out this actual policy is. You can't answer how many councils you've spoken to. You can't answer how much capital cost there could be to this. And you cannot answer that if there is a capital expenditure, that you will cover it.
Well, I think you've set out the reason why you'll be voting against free school meals for all kids in London on Thursday.
Can I just to step in there so we don't go round and round in circles?
Of course you will.
So the question is, there's the commitment to roll out this programme, and I understand the question is then if there's capital costs, if there's an increase in prices, the commitment is to cover that cost. Is that the question?
Yes.
And I think you said there's a commitment to cover that cost because it will be rolled out in September. And if there's conversations to be had in the future, those conversations will be had. So I just didn't want to misrepresent the position.
Thank you.
Yep. And that's the stated position.
Right. Have you looked at targeting or means-tested way, or is just blanket?
No, just like I don't believe in means testing free travel for those above the age of 60. Unless the member suggests otherwise, or state pensions, or access to a GP, or access to a primary school, or access to a secondary school. I'm not suggesting means testing free school meals for those primary school children in London.
Okay, so this funding's there for 1 year, is that correct?
The monies in this budget that we've announced in the budget that I set out yesterday is to support families during this rising cost of living.
Yeah, I know
and the
that.
monies we have, as Senator Harani asked, is not recurring. It's one-off, and that's why I've been quite transparent to the schools, the councils, the caterers, the families, and so forth. What I can confirm is, 1 year's sum of money.
So it's a 1 year sum of money. So if councils take on extra staff in their kitchens, they'll have to do it on a 1 year term in effect then, or actually from September through till May, because they won't know if the funding's there to continue.
I think the members making the point we've made, this government's outrageous policy of just giving 1 year grants.
I'm not talking about the government, I'm talking about you. I'm asking you. Just answer the questions, Mr. Mayor.
Well, you can't have it both ways. you can ask a question, then good manners suggest you wait for the answer.
If you answer properly, yes.
So let's get the answer from the Mayor.
Now,
You won't answer.
as I said at the beginning of this Budget and Performance Committee, when I was a minister, we gave councils and regional government a 3-year settlement to enable them to make long-term plans. The same conundrum we have, because the government gives us only 1 year's worth of grants, sometimes recurring, sometimes non-recurring, is a challenge that schools, public services and others have across the city. What I'm able to say to them in a transparent way is I can guarantee 1 year's worth of funding. Just like when it comes to monies for the VIU, often it's 1 year, and so often it's difficult to for youth clubs, youth workers and others to employ staff for more than 1 year. It's a challenge. And that's why the sooner the government keeps its promise that it made some time ago for 3-year settlements, the sooner we'll be able to give certainty to schools, families and others about long-term announcements.
And
So-
just can I clarify a factual point, which is that the funding here is for the school year 23-24. So there is no reason that this scheme need end in May 24, as the Assembly member said, unless, I guess, a newly elected mayor then were to decide that they wanted to cut it with immediate effect.
Okay, I'll leave that, and perhaps in a timely way, Mr. Bellamy, we can have some of the answers to some of the questions I posed on this, because it looks to me like you perhaps did arrange it over the weekend without actually finding out what capital costs would be incurred. I'll move on to something else now, Chair. How do you intend to use the additional £38 million that's been added to the Environmental Improvement Reserve?
Yeah. The committee will remember, I guess, a couple of things. Firstly, the Mayor's commitment to tackling the climate emergency and obviously other related factors such as London's toxic air and the congestion on our roads. A year ago, the Mayor therefore announced the Green Bond Programme. And the feedback we got from the committee at the time was that this very much came out of thin air to you, and so really, what this money allows, as I say, is for the Mayor to go further in these areas. What we think is right is that we keep officers and everybody else focused on the delivery of the Green Bond, and then based on that, learning the lessons, taking any feedback from the Assembly, its committees about how we can further improve London's environment. Then we will set out later in the year how we plan to use that money.
You will set that out because the budget shows no planned movement in the reserve between now and 25-26, remaining at 134 million throughout.
Yeah, because we need to have an agreed profile of that spend before we can put it in. So clearly we're not at that point. To be fair, we're in the same situation around the revenue costs associated with the Green Bond, where at this stage relatively few of those have actually been profiled in, and so the show has not been spent, even though obviously absolutely it's the Mayor's intention to do so.
You have reserves all over the place. Have you ever added them all up?
Oh, there are tables in the budget documents that do just that.
Right. What is the total amount of reserves in all the different areas?
If I could refer the Assembly member to page...
Just read it out to me, that would be helpful.
From what date?
Just the total.
Okay, so as at 31st of March 2023, the total reserves are just over 2.1 billion, and they are projected to fall, subject to the important caveat the Chief of Staff just set out, to 1.8 billion by 31st of March 26.
Yeah, it's good to hear that out loud, £2.1 billion. Thank you. If we can move on to MOPAC now. So what is the first year or the full year cost of the additional 500 PCSOs? And how do you intend to fund that in 24-25?
For the sake of those watching, it's just worth emphasising that Standard & Poor's said that GLA had prudent debt and liquidity practices, which meant that we got an AA credit rating. I'd rather trust Standard & Poor's rather than somebody belonging to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's party.
Well, there was no need for that, was there, Mr Mayor? Just like to get these little barred comments in, don't we? Going back to MOPAC.
Going back to MOPAC, the full year cost of the additional 500 PCSOs is £26.8 million, which is fully funded for 23-24 and subsequent years in this budget.
Okay, fine. And the Commissioner told the committee in December that he needed tens of millions for the reform of the MPS. So on what basis did you decide to allocate 15 million additional funding for this?
So that's not accurate. Actually, there's much more allocated than that. The £15 million, we touched on it earlier, is the money for improvements in the HR support available to managers within MPS and their leadership training. So that is only one element of the funding the Commissioner and the Mayor have agreed for the reform of the MPS. Another one, for example, would be the PCSOs that we just spoke about.
Okay, what's the total?
I'm not sure I have a precise figure in front of me for the total because it's a combination of use of revenue funding, it's some capital investment, and it's also a drawdown on the Met's reserves.
Can you, Mr. Galley, can you put some light on that? I like getting the full figure.
I haven't got the figures in front of me. We can happily write to you on that detail.
Yeah. And all the stuff that's being written to us, can we have that before Thursday? That would be really helpful.
Well, if you committee in the usual way can write and set out what the questions are, my experience teaches me that sometimes the question that you ask in writing is different to what I hear in the meeting. So absolutely, if you write quickly, then we'll respond as quickly as we can.
We'll try and pick that up. Thank you.
Okay, I've finished. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're now moving to Assemblymember Clark. Oh, sorry, you're quite right. Assemblymember, sorry, you want to come in?
Sorry, Assemblymember Clark. Yeah. Sorry, just continuing on the policing theme. This could be a question either to you, Mr. Mayor, or your Chief of Staff. So about the additional £15 million funding for reform of the Met, how do you envisage monitoring the effectiveness of this investment?
Sure, I'll ask David to come to the point you raised, but first, really important to give the context in relation to how we got where we are.
Yeah.
And so Mark set this out. So Mark said there's been an £878 million cut from the police service over the last 13 years, and we would need a 27% increase to take us back to where we were in 2010. So this money that we're announcing today, improving standards, increasing trust, high visibility policing, is trying to fill the massive hole left by what Sir Mark says is a £878 million cut, on top of which there's a shortfall of £159 million with the national and international capital cities grant. So we're doing what we can to make up for the government's policies of the last 13 years. One of those is the £50 million in relation to standards that Dave's going to give you some details for.
Yeah. And so what would I say? There's two components to that. One component, around about £5 million, is additional HR support, and then the balance is leadership training. And in terms of the leadership training, the Met will be putting together a business case in terms of how it is going to approach that, and obviously, as you would expect from any business case, that's going to be able to set out, the benefits to be secured and how they will be monitored. And so that will control that aspect of it. And I think the overall, the funding overall has the fundamental requirement about improving the culture of the Met, and so you're going to be looking at the measures there, the detail in the turnaround plan, and ultimately wanting to see fewer misconduct cases being brought against officers, and Londoners having higher degrees of trust or confidence in their police service.
So I mean, look, training obviously is an ongoing thing, and these are some fundamental reforms that we are talking about. But perhaps I should still ask you this. Do you think that the program, as it stands right now, will be complete by the end of the 2023/24 financial year? Or will it require spending across more years to come?
Yes, good question. Look, there's two things just to say in response to that. One is, don't forget, Louise Casey has not published her final report. That may pose other issues, recommendations that we've got to take on board. The way Sir Mark responded to a similar question he was asked was, it will take at least 2 years to see the progress we want to see in the police service. These are systemic, endemic issues that didn't happen overnight, so they can't be solved overnight. What we've done is delivered on Sir Mark's wish in relation to the leadership work required. If you remember, Unmesh, one of the issues raised by Dame Louise Casey was the issue of line managers not having the skills, the support from HR and so forth. So this addresses that particular issue. And also we wait further details of the turnaround plan that David referred to as well. But I think it'd be unrealistic for either of us to expect by this time next year to see the sort of progress we want to see across the police service.
Indeed. I mean, we'll talk of some fundamental reforms here. Again, look, going back to the big picture, because the public out there is more concerned about how your budgetary measures actually help them out there on the ground. And you talked much earlier on in this session about people feeling safe. So how, Mr. Mayor, how will the additional PCSOs support neighbourhood policing and help rebuild relationships between the Met and Londoners?
Yeah, thanks. There's two issues in this budget, at least two issues that will address that issue. One is an increase of almost more than 50% of police community support officers in our city. We've been realistic about this year. We think we can get 500 this year. The second big issue is the support victims receive. One of the things that you and I both have done is spoken to victims who say they feel let down when they can't get through in relation to the phone line and so forth, the call centre. So some of this support we're giving in this budget is also towards improving the experience of victims as well, because unfortunately, with the best from the world, there are still going to be victims of crime. It's their contact with the police, getting a good service from them, and then going forward through the criminal justice service.
And a couple more points through you, Chair. I think in an announcement that came out in the form of a press release a couple of days ago, Mayor announces further £8.5 million to tackle violence across the capital and raise standards in the Met. Of this, 3-point-something was for police reforms, but the other two announcements relate to tackling drug supply lines and expanding the work of your violence reduction unit. So I'm just looking at the press release. I don't think this has had much publicity.
Yeah, so some of this is, thank you for your questions. Yeah. So some of this is recurring. So the victim support stuff is recurring, which is great news. Protection ADA has been really successful in relation to tackling county lines. And so what we're able to do is do a couple of things. Firstly, carry that forward recurrent in relation to the work of ADA. That's within London as well, county lines. And secondly is county lines training as well for partners of the police as well. Both Project ADA in tackling county lines and also the work done outside of London and within London is really important. Just to give you an idea of the reason for why I agreed this funding was the work of Project ADA in just 3 months saw the closure of 52 county lines and the seizure of £400,000 cash. And so it's really important to give the police that support going forward, and this budget gives them certainty going forward, which is really important.
And finally, Mr. Mayor, budgets for me are about politics, policies, and priorities. And I hope to say this about your free school meals program. Certainly for the families who stand to benefit to the tune of £440 per child, it's certainly not grandstanding, and I would certainly not call it a grand policy on your behalf. I think it's a much-needed measure in the current cost of living crisis. So well done, Mr. Mayor. It's something I always championed over the many, many years, and that's why I'm in politics.
Well, thanks so much. I look forward to this budget being passed unanimously on Thursday and seeing who is against our children having a hot, nutritious, healthy meal.
And that's what makes politics worthwhile, changing society for the better.
Thank you. Assembly Member Clark.
Yes, thank you for that. And just having, before I ask questions on the LFC, I just want to reflect on a few things I've heard this morning. As some of you may know, I've been a school governor at 3 different schools for probably combined over 25 years. And I will say one thing, in reflecting on why schools themselves really struggle is that school governors have been making very difficult choices around staff retention, around putting money into buildings, and that's because of choices made at government filtering down to schools. And if you walk into some of the schools we now have, and this is no reflection on the families who send their children to local schools or the staff, but our schools need investment. So that doesn't take away from the need for meals, and it's a very welcome plan indeed. And I want to thank you for not just providing free school meals for primary school, but improving air quality for all. So I very much look forward to that passing unanimously on Thursday. So that aside, you have allocated to the LFC an additional nearly £10 million for higher pay since the December budget. What level of pay rise does this assume over the next 2 years?
Yeah, thanks for your comments and your question. So in relation to the London Fire Brigade, they're receiving, I think, an additional, not just an additional sum in this budget, £1.1 million, which is an additional £9.9 million to provide funding for the higher pay and inflation. But the additional monies that I announced at previous Budget Performance Committee and the plenary, without wishing to go into the negotiations and the ballot and so forth, we are doing what we can to support the London Fire Brigade. We know our firefighters, do an incredible job under difficult circumstances. We know the challenges and culture within the fire service. Nobody wants industrial action. I've got a huge amount of respect for the work of the FBU as well as the LFB, and we're hoping this additional money we've been able to announce will, get the offer over the line.
Okay, thank you for that. And what is the estimate? I mean, right now we've talked a lot about the culture review and the cost, and the real terms cost of not implementing it. Do you have an idea of the financial impact of the implementations of the cost from the culture review?
Yeah, I want to bring David in shortly, because the good news with the London Fire Brigade, when you compare it to the Met Police Service, is they're a bit ahead in relation to the work they've been doing. So a number of when David was answering a question previously about the Met Police Service, the leadership work and so forth, this was additional monies to address the issue of professional standards in the Met Police Service. The good news in terms of budget issues is for the LFB that work's already begun, and so you're not seeing equivalent sums of money for the LFB as you are for the MPS, plus it's smaller as well. But I'll ask David to just talk about some of the support we are giving the LFB in relation to addressing some of the issues from AVSAL and the other work in relation to culture and standards.
Yeah, so I mean, some of them, as the Mayor says, the LFB is ahead in terms of that, that support on the HR side. One of the SR recommendations was an independent review of the people services function. That has literally just been completed, and so obviously there will need to be time to digest that and determine whether any financial implications flow from that. The other big thing, I think, is around pushing on with the Privacy for All programme and ensuring that fire stations are properly configured for all their staff and give them privacy. That's clearly capital expenditure and is something that the brigade has capacity to do. And when I spoke to the Commissioner about it briefly, I forget whether it was last week or the week before, he was comfortable that the costs that would flow from the culture review, they would be able to build into their budget, and they wouldn't need additional funding from the Mayor to do so. And of course, as you'll appreciate, as well as all the things that that are good that will flow from the culture review, one of those is hopefully lowering staff sickness levels, which lowers the overtime bill, and that's clearly an important consideration for the brigades as well.
Thank you for that. And carrying on from lowering sick staff levels, clearly a lot of costs is around staffing, but since 2014 the number of LFB staff has reduced by about 10%, or 5,600 personnel. But given the amount of work following on from the Grenfell review, the staff requirements, the workload has increased. Has government provided any additional funding to resolve the increase in this workload, or are they expecting staff to work for longer?
So there has been funding for things around building safety. What I think we're not clear on yet is whether that is going to get built into baseline funding in the future as we wait for the various legislation and secondary legislation to come through and be enacted. So it's a little bit of a watch this space, I'm afraid.
That's fine. Okay, thank you, and thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I had some questions about the reserves, but we've covered some of it. So in an attempt to push forward time, I just asked just a couple of specific questions. And again, I'm not rehearsing the argument about S&P, and I think David, Etel are doing great jobs and well done. But we talked about the level of reserves being at 2.1 billion, moving to 1.8. And there's a constant forecast that those reserves are going to reduce, right? But I had a look at the MTFS, and looking specifically at the Transport Services Funding Reserve, the Environmental Impact Reserve, I don't think there was any movement there over the next 2 or 3 years. And I think the Climate Change Reserve, there's only a tiny movement. So I was just wondering, what were the projections on some of that reserve spend and the decision-making process behind it?
I think, as the Chief of Staff has explained, what we're doing on those forecasts is just basically setting out where we are in formal decision-making now. Clearly, there will be decisions taken forward on all those items over the next period, which will then change the profile. I mean, just to give you kind of one practical example on the GLA Mayor budget, for instance, although the level of reserves in GLA Mayor, as you say, are subject to that important limitation, looking at it realistically, what's going to happen, albeit not yet the formal decision-making, I'm anticipating there'll be a reduction in the GLA Mayor reserves of about 110 million that would reflect the drawdown of things like Election Reserve, Mayor of London, Museum of London, the work on the Green Bond, etc., etc. So there's a whole set of work that we're doing. So we are rather trapped in those figures to set out what's formally there, rather than making those figures reflecting the reality of what will happen. Because clearly, as the Mayor and Chief of Staff has said, the intent is for those reserves to be used and deployed to ensure we have delivery.
So that's what I suspected, and to be fair, David, that's what you were setting out earlier. There's a pipeline coming through. So looking at those reserves, we can expect to start seeing plans come forward when? I mean, is it just going to be an ongoing process?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a specific situation about each example. So, for instance, David mentioned the new Museum of London. So the Mayor has taken, I believe, the mayoral decision to confirm that the GLA will be making a £70 million contribution to that project. Now, that's been our intention really since 2016, and we've been providing for that contribution into reserve at around £3 million a year. And so now I know David's team are negotiating with the City Corporation about the right timing for that payment to be going across to the museum, given the phasings of the construction work. And so, we can't reflect it in the budget right now because we don't know precisely what that timing will be. But as soon as we have that, then we'll be able to reflect it in the budget. And the same is true as we approve individual schemes for the Green Bond and any revenue support that those schemes need. Well, then we'll be that will be able to be plugged into the budget.
So being very parochial, it's things like the Crystal Palace National Sports Centre is buried. The spend for that will be in that money somewhere, but it's not specifically allocated yet. And then I guess there's a conversation to have about how we as a committee sort of see that decision making coming through, rather than having it sort of a fait accompli.
I mean, just to clarify the position on Crystal Palace, as you know, obviously we've not disclosed, for reasons you'll understand, and we explained why there isn't a figure, but the funding source for Crystal Palace is actually coming from our capital receipts, plus an element of business rates, deliberately obscured here for reasons that explain.
I've got the meeting this afternoon, so
I'm sure we can explain that in more detail, perhaps in confidence.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you very much. Right, we now move to Caroline Russell to talk climate budget and green bonds.
Thank you very much, Chair. So yes, this year has been the first year of the climate budget, and it's certainly been very instructive for us on this side of the table. But I'd like to know what you think is next for the GLA's climate budget work and what lessons you feel you've learned from this first year of creating a climate budget, which is really, I think it must be one of the only cities in the world that's ever done it. So it is a interesting and groundbreaking piece of work.
It breaks my heart to say we weren't first. Kills me, but Oslo got there before us. Raymond Johansson, the governing mayor, is a great guy. He's been doing it for 7 years. I spoke to him last week, and he's incredibly proud that we've learnt from the work that Oslo are doing. I mean, we went over this last time. I don't want to go over them again in relation to the challenges with the bond market, small b, rather than the James type. So the way to think about this in terms of City Hall is green finance, using interim cash flows and then the green bond, but also skilling up, frankly speaking. I don't mean this in any way to be offensive to our staff, but skilling up our staff to make this a mainstream issue, but also have the expertise with David and around David G to make sure that we've got the right processes in place, because the really important thing, Caroline, is we want this to be a success, right? And that's why actually somebody kicking the tyres is a good thing for us, because we want it to be a success going out. And then over the course of the next year, how we involved London councils, other parts of the London family that emit carbon, frankly speaking, and need to step up to the game. And so the progress this year is, Enver did a great piece of work in relation to the carbon budgeting. He's brought in the GLA families, the TFLs, the MPSs, the LFBs, the DCs, and so forth. And so you now know we now have known knowns, to talk of Rumsfeld speak, rather than unknown unknowns. And so we now know what is costed, what is not costed, and that is really important to buy in London councils and others, because unless we do it first and show leadership, they won't. The good news is, before I ask David G if there's anything he wants to add, is I've now got confidence that there's a team here that understand this issue, and the key thing is for David and Enver to be confident that there is a relevant level of knowledge in this area.
So we've already begun speaking to the London Environment Directors Network, the LEDNet, and they are, I'm pushing against an open door. It's the treasurers that they said we need to talk to, but they're opening the doors, and with my colleague on my right will hopefully, once we begin that conversation as well, we can move forward and share what we've been learning with the London boroughs. I'm not saying necessarily that they don't have things that we can learn from as well. There's some really good plans that some have got in place, but sharing ideas. What we also have is a team that we've now recruited with carbon analysts. So we'll go back through those numbers that you can see in Appendix J that one of your colleagues kindly sat down with us on, and that team will now go back through these figures and actually test the consistency. So in terms of one of the lessons learned, there were some inconsistencies in how some teams were calculating in some parts with others, but they all engaged, so it's not a criticism, it's everybody brought something else to the table. So over the coming months we hope to refine what we've already published, and then in parallel work with the London boroughs, and at the same time see which schemes are more viable to be considered along with the green financing. I won't use bond at the moment because we've got to wait for the market to be right, but either for a green facility. Mm-hmm. So we've got the, as an example, the stadium roof is an example of one that we thought might have been viable, but we need experts who can say how practical is it to put solar paneling onto the roof of that. So it's nothing to do with finance people delaying it or environment people delaying it. We're waiting for experts to say how practical is that. That's just one example. We've got the district heat network that we've spoken about before. Again, that's going through the right processes. So all of these things are happening simultaneously.
Okay, that's really useful. So you've kind of it sounds like there's been a lot of learning through the process of this year. I just want to clarify, because you've started talking about London councils getting involved next year. Now, this year we're looking at London Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but just for the GLA family. So when it says next year we're looking at London Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, does that mean for local authorities across London, or does it mean all businesses, everything in London?
24-25 is local authorities.
Okay.
It would be too ambitious to go for everybody. I think it's ambitious even with the local authorities for 24-25, but all businesses, we would hope we would move forward in the subsequent couple of years.
Okay, and then, because in what was reported to us, when the climate budget process was all set out, we were told then in 25-26 we were going to be also looking at scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions that occur outside London but are driven by activities in London, so like food that's grown elsewhere but is eaten in London. So do you think that it is that, given what you've learnt this year, do you think that it's viable to be dealing with scope 3 emissions in the 25-26 year, or do you think that you're going to need a couple of years to get the local authorities on board with proper climate budgeting?
We aimed high in 25-26. You said we were ambitious. We might be ambitious. The Oslo team that the Mayor referred to is holding our hand. They're delighted with the progress we've made. They want us to co-host a rollout of a further 44 cities around the world. And my sort of bargaining chip with them is, can you help us reach what we're trying to do in London over the next 3 years? So I'm hoping with their help, they can help us analyse whether 25, 26, 26, 27, what is the right target. At the moment, we put a very aspirational target on that. I'm not deviating away from it at the moment, but we have to keep the door open that it might have been a little bit overstretching.
Better to be ambitious and then be honest that you've been over-ambitious and kind of, be able to clarify that during the process next year than not to try to get stuff done. So even if you get the 240 million that's needed to fund the initiatives that have been identified by the process this year, we are still going to need stronger steps, more work done in order to get to net zero by 2030. So are you taking any actions now to plan for that, sort of particularly as you're thinking about moving to including the local authorities in the process next year?
So I think that the government's on the same page as us in relation to the importance of decarbonising. So the government, for example, has a public decarbonisation scheme, a fund. And some of the work we've done is getting the bids ready to apply for that. We simply won't be able to get anywhere near net zero without government support, more powers and resources. And so we continue to lobby in Chivy Way. I'm not quite clear yet the consequences of the government reorganisation that took place about 3 weeks ago, the various new departments and stuff. It sounds like it helps this agenda. We'll have to wait and see
what the practical details are. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the green bonds, you've got 130 million set aside for those, which is up from 96 million. And that money is sitting there, not actually doing anything. Now, David Galley, you said at the 5th of January meeting that there was an acid test for you was the green bond needed to be more efficient and a better deal financially than using Public Works Loan Board borrowing. Are there any other sort of, so you've got the test between the Public Works Loan Board and the green bonds, but are there any other tests that you've got that, because we keep coming up against this through this meeting, that there's a lot of money sitting in reserves, there's a lot of money waiting to be allocated. So just so that we really understand, is that Public Works Loan Board the only test that you've got for the green bonds, or are there other things that are kind of controlling that decision about whether you're going to start issuing those?
Just to clarify, so there are two funds here. There's the original 90 million in last year's budget, and then there's the new environmental improvement reserve of 134 million. So there's two things there. And very much so, there's a whole series of tests that we are looking about the appraisal of projects that get into the pipeline to utilise those funds. So very much there's a whole analysis that we would do as to what then goes forward. And I think in particular for me, one of the things that I'm very keen to ensure we can deploy the money is looking at incentivising functional bodies to actually utilise our funding regime by effectively, some sort of form of subsidy of the capital financing costs that would emerge, which is supported by the 90 million or 75 million fund that we have available. So very much a whole series of tests to be applied, beyond the crude test of what actually, in terms of the borrowing, whether it be through PWLB or green bond, which route we go down. That's in many ways a kind of second order analysis that we would do as to the mechanics of actually getting the funding in, as against the detailed appraisal process that we have through an environmental steering group which the Chief of Staff chairs.
So is that all set out anywhere in are there terms of reference for the environmental steering group that would help us to understand how those decision-making processes to start releasing that funding for the green bonds might work?
So what we're in the process of doing, and we've got another meeting on Friday. I get to get or see the papers for it. But what we absolutely want to have is a very clear governance process that shows how schemes, whether they're GLA Group, local, a London Borough, whatever it may be, go from, here's an idea, through to finance. And obviously, as we go through that process, some schemes will make it through, others, won't be financeable for whatever reason. And so, I think, one of the things that we're not at that point yet, but I want us to be soon, is to have that kind of crystal clear process, and then we can set that out publicly, and it will help the Assembly understand as then individual schemes move through it and the status and the rate of progress.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So my next question is about power purchase agreements and private wire arrangements for increasing renewable energy as a proportion of energy used in the GLA group. Do you have a firm timeline on these? So
TfL's purchase power agreement is back out to tender at the moment, and then I don't immediately have the details in front of me, but then when that finishes, we will take the learning from that and then bring that into the first group-wide PPA scheme.
Okay, so but you don't have any idea when that? Are you able to tell us when that current TfL process will be finished?
Not off the top of my head, unless you can remember, David.
It's imminent because it's out to procurement. But as David said, obviously we need to see the results of that to then lock that down. But then obviously from that, the learning from that then prompts then the group-wide PPA that we'd look to then launch subsequently. Okay.
Thank you. And then finally, a couple of questions on the TfL's draft climate change adaptation plan. So very good to see your plan published last week. And it includes a plan to have a quantitative, data-driven approach to include an adaptation-related metric in the TfL scorecard by 2030. Why is it going to take so long to develop that?
To be honest, I don't know. I haven't actually read that plan yet. One or two other things going on, and I will. But that's a.
Could you perhaps come back with a written answer to that one to the committee?
I will do, and apologies, I should know the answer, but just to reassure you, there is incredible expertise amongst the NEDs on the TfL board in this series, so I'm sure there's a good reason, but let me get back to you.
Thank you very much. And then the 23-24 TfL business plan allocates £2 million a year on adaptation, but your draft adaptation plan says that you lost 8 million in TfL revenue due to the heatwave last year, and 2 million was lost due to flooding the year before. So don't you need to be spending more on climate adaptation to protect TfL and London as a whole?
Absolutely, but some of this is outside our control for obvious reasons. I mean, TfL will do what they can to mitigate and adapt. But you've got 2 months' worth of rain falling in 2 hours. There's not a lot TfL can do to protect, particularly some of the DLR stations and some of the deep underground stations. But it's not an issue of lack of funding. It's an issue of what can we do with the limited resources we have. And so we are speaking to the government about what we can do together, because of the economic knock-on consequence in relation to tubes being shut and so forth.
Absolutely, and we've been seeing, the line from Waterloo to the southwest, where they had a landslip at Hook recently, which has massively impacted rail services. Yeah. The TfL needs to be planning and making sure that we are protecting our rail embankments in London. You mentioned the risk of flooding for tube stations. That's why I'm asking, is 2 million really enough in the TfL business plan?
I agree with you. That is a fair point. But don't forget, some of the other stuff we're doing deals with this indirectly. I'll give you an example. So the new DLR trains that I went to see a couple of weeks ago, the first of which passengers will start benefiting from next year, they're all air-conditioned. Why is that important? Because we really can't have people using public transport when it's north of 40 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
But now, that, strictly speaking, isn't a climate change adaptation point, and so we are doing what we can to try and make sure this is part of our core business, adaptations and resilience. But I take your point, and within the realms of making savings of £600 million on top of £1.1 billion, bringing in additional revenues of £500 million, some things I've got to give. But you make a very poor point. There's an economic case to do this, because it's nonsensical to lose money because we have not done it.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. A couple of questions from me just to wrap up. The first is about the report that was sent across from this committee. We sent it across in January. We're just wondering when we could expect a full response from our report.
Yeah, and that's on my desk just to finalise that. To be honest, if this wasn't happening, you probably would have it by now.
I appreciate it.
As this is happening, it's probably going to be next week, to be honest, because my diary's chocker for the rest of the week. But as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you. And then, just in terms of what's feeding into that final budget that will have the assembly-wide discussion on Thursday, I was just wondering what were the flavour of responses that came back from the consultation budget, and was there anything that moved as a result? From the consultation, the public consultation, I mean.
We have obviously given the Assembly a summary of the public consultation. I think I would say that there was nothing in it that was kind of like a big point that would lead to, a notable change. But I think there were some points of detail that will be picked up and sent through into the relevant projects.
Okay. I think we'll have more to discuss with that on Thursday. Are there any other questions from members of the committee? No. All right. Well, I'd like to thank our guests for attending this morning and for the answers to our questions. As I say, as ever in this point in the process, please feel free to move on to the next part of your day, but we thank you for coming. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Thank you. We also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group leaders to agree any output arising from the meeting. Agenda item 8 is the Budget and Performance Committee work programme. Can we note the committee's work programme for 22-23? Date of next meeting for the committee will be held on the 14th of March 23 at 10 a.m. in the chamber. And finally, any other business? I have no urgent business today, so that concludes the meeting.